It began with a river that did not want to be crossed. The Rhine moved like a living thing, wide, dark, restless, dragging the reflections of burning towns and broken bridges across its surface. Its waters had carried traders, kings, pilgrims, and conquerors for centuries. But now it carried only wreckage, wood and metal drifting like the remains of failed promises. To the Germans, the Rhine was a final shield, the last natural barrier holding back the collapse of a world they were trying desperately to pretend could still be saved. To the Americans standing on the western bank, staring across that cold expanse, it looked like the very edge of the war itself, a border between everything they had survived and the ending they could almost touch, but not yet claim. The land leading to the river was scarred in every direction. Shell craters pooled with icy rainwater. Farmhouses slumped inward like tired lungs. Trees were stripped of their branches, leaving them clawing toward the grey sky like skeletons, begging for mercy. The war had passed through these fields like a storm that neither forgave nor forgot. And now the river waited ahead, silent, reflecting a world that had forgotten how to be whole. The Americans knew the crossing would not be simple. The enemy had torn down bridges one by one, sending thousands of tons of steel crashing into the current. German engineers wired charges under every structure, prepared to send them into the depths before a single Allied boot could touch them. Entire towns on the far shore were turned into fortress networks, machine gun nests hidden in windows, artillery zeroed in on the water, snipers waiting in the dark bones of destroyed churches. Every metre of that riverbank was a question with no gentle answer. But still, the Americans advanced. The night before the crossing was a night without time. Command posts, lit by lanterns, glowed beneath tarps fluttering in cold wind. Officers traced lines on maps with trembling fingers. Engineers whispered over stacks of pontoons, listening to the groans of machinery that would be tested under fire. Infantry cleaned their rifles with numb hands, staring at the black shape of the river as if trying to memorize it. Some prayed, some wrote letters. Some simply sat in silence, feeling the weight of what tomorrow would demand. Then came the moments just before dawn, moments when the world held its breath. Artillery roared to life, shaking the earth and lighting the fog in pulses of fire. Smoke drifted across the water like wandering spirits. The river churned under the shockwaves. And from the western bank, boats began to push off. Canvas boats, metal assault craft, rafts barely sturdy enough to carry hope. Soldiers hunched against the cold spray, their helmets catching faint glimmers of grey morning. The oars dipped into the water quietly, almost respectfully, as if the river itself were listening. German guns opened fire, almost immediately. Shells screamed overhead. Bullets snapped across the surface, kicking up sprays of icy water. Searchlights cut through the smoke. But the Americans kept moving. They rode through hell because turning back was never an option. They reached the far shore and leapt into mud, into chaos, into a storm waiting to swallow them whole. More waves followed. Engineers braved gunfire to build floating bridges piece by piece, hammering steel into place as rounds tore the air around them. Tanks eventually crawled across these fragile paths, their weight making every beam tremble like it might snap. But the bridges held. The soldiers held. The line held. And slowly, painfully, the Rhine stopped being a barrier. It became a doorway. Once the Americans surged across, the war changed. The final act had begun. Germany's western defences buckled, their lines fractured, their retreat accelerated. What lay ahead was not peace, not yet, but the beginning of the end, carried on the current of a river that, for centuries, had shaped the history of Europe. Tonight, we return to that crossing, to the cold water churning under assault boats, to the roar of artillery echoing across mist, to the trembling bridges carrying men toward the final chapter of a brutal war, to the moment when the river that once divided a continent became the pathway to ending its darkest chapter. Before we continue, I want to ask you something quietly. In your own words, where are you listening from tonight, and what is the feeling in the room around you? Calm? Dim? Safe? I want to picture the space you're in. And something else, a more personal question. As you listen to this story, is there a memory from your own life that drifts to the surface? Not a painful one, just a moment that stays with you for reasons you can't fully explain. If you feel comfortable, share it. And one more invitation, gentle and unique. Think of a place you've stood in your life where you felt like you were crossing into something new, not a river, but a moment. What did it feel like? You can tell me, or you can just hold the thought quietly for yourself as we move forward. And if these long, soft journeys into history help you slow down, settle your breathing, or drift into sleep, consider subscribing. September 1944. Allied headquarters at Versailles, France. Staff officers crowd around a massive table covered with reconnaissance photographs and hand-drawn maps. Supreme Commander Dwight Eisenhower leans forward, tracing his finger along a blue line that cuts through the heart of the map like a surgical scar, the Rhine River. 300 meters wide in some places, 400 in others, flowing swift and cold from the Swiss Alps to the North Sea. Behind that ribbon of water lies Germany's industrial heartland, the factories and cities that feed the Nazi war machine. Between the advancing Allied armies and final victory stands this ancient barrier, a river that has protected Germanic peoples for 2,000 years. The officers exchange glances. Someone mutters that Napoleon crossed it in 1805. Another points out that the Romans built bridges here before Christ was born. But those armies weren't facing Wehrmacht engineers with demolition charges and a fanatical determination to defend the fatherland. Eisenhower straightens up, his face grim. The question isn't whether they'll cross the Rhine. The question is, how many men will die trying? The Rhine wasn't just any river. Its dimensions alone made it a military nightmare. Stretching over 800 miles from Switzerland to the Netherlands, the river varied in width from 250 to over 400 meters at the points where Allied planners needed to cross. The current moved at 6 to 8 miles per hour in most sectors, fast enough to sweep away a loaded assault boat or drown a soldier in full combat gear within minutes. Reconnaissance flights throughout the fall of 1944 brought back photographs that told a sobering story. The river's depth ranged from 20 to 30 feet in the centre channel, too deep for wading, too wide for conventional bridging without massive engineering support. Intelligence officers calculated that moving a single infantry division across would require thousands of boats, hundreds of trips, and hours of exposure to German artillery fire from observers who could see every movement from the eastern bank. The numbers grew more daunting with each analysis. 10 divisions would need to cross in the first wave to establish defensible bridgeheads. That meant moving over 150,000 men, their weapons, their vehicles, their supplies across a river that had stopped armies for millennia. History weighed heavily on the Allied planners. The Rhine occupied a sacred place in German consciousness, far beyond its strategic value. Romantic poets had written odes to its beauty. Wagner had set operas along its banks. German schoolchildren learned that the river represented the boundary between civilization and barbarism, between Germanic order and foreign chaos. The Nazis had exploited this mythology relentlessly, transforming the Rhine from geographical feature into nationalist symbol. Propaganda broadcasts promised that no enemy would ever cross the sacred German river. Hitler himself had declared that the Rhine would run red with Allied blood before a single enemy soldier reached the eastern shore. This wasn't mere rhetoric. The psychological power of the Rhine as Germany's last natural fortress couldn't be quantified in intelligence reports, but every Allied commander understood its weight. Soldiers fighting to defend their homeland, behind a barrier their culture had sanctified, would fight with desperate determination. The river wasn't just water and current, it was the physical embodiment of German resistance. By late September 1944, Allied forces were reaching the Rhine's western approaches. Reconnaissance patrols from 1st Army came within sight of the river near Aachen. British forces pushed toward the Dutch river crossings. American 3rd Army units approached from the south. Each approach brought the same devastating sight: demolished bridges. German engineers had done their work with Teutonic thoroughness. Every bridge, every ferry crossing, every possible passage had been prepared for destruction months in advance. As Allied spearheads drew near, Wehrmacht demolition teams executed their orders with precision. Massive explosions sent centuries-old stone bridges crumbling into the river. Steel railroad bridges collapsed in tangles of twisted metal. Smaller highway bridges simply disappeared in clouds of debris and spray. Soldiers who reached the Rhine's western bank found themselves staring across an impassable barrier at an enemy who held every advantage. The Germans owned the high ground on the eastern shore. They had pre-sighted artillery positions covering every metre of the western bank. They could see everything while remaining largely invisible themselves. The aerial reconnaissance footage brought back to Eisenhower's headquarters painted an even grimmer picture. Fortress cities lined the Rhine's eastern shore like pearls on a string. Cologne, Düsseldorf, Mainz, Mannheim, each was a medieval strongpoint, modernized with concrete bunkers and interconnected defensive positions. The cities themselves became weapons. Their stone buildings provided ready-made fortifications. Their cellars and sewers offered covered routes for defenders to shift positions. Church steeples became observation posts, with commanding views of any Western Bank activity. Allied photo interpreters counted machine gun nests, artillery emplacements, and anti-tank positions until their eyes blurred. The fortifications extended far beyond the cities. German engineers had spent the previous months creating an interlocking defensive system that multiplied their combat power. Trenches zigzagged along the eastern shore, concrete bunkers positioned every 500 metres, covered approaches with overlapping fields of fire. Wire obstacles, minefields, and anti-tank ditches created killing zones where attackers would be channeled into predetermined death traps. Intelligence estimates grew darker throughout October and November. Ultra-decrypts and prisoner interrogations suggested that Germany had positioned over 60 divisions to defend the Rhine approaches. These weren't the depleted, demoralised units the Allies had been facing in France. Many were fresh formations, pulled from other fronts or rebuilt from survivors of earlier battles. They included SS divisions still committed to Nazi ideology, paratroop units with elite training, and Volkssturm Home Guard battalions filled with old men and teenagers who would defend their homeland with whatever weapons they could carry. The Wehrmacht might be losing the war, but they weren't beaten yet. Not here. Not at the Rhine. Allied intelligence officers calculated that the Germans could mass 1,500 artillery pieces to defend the river crossings. That was enough firepower to turn any crossing attempt into a bloodbath. The mathematics of assault river crossings were brutally simple. Attackers in boats couldn't return fire effectively. They were silhouetted against the water, they moved slowly, predictably. Defenders with prepared positions, protected by cover, with unlimited ammunition, held every advantage. First-hand accounts from soldiers who reached the Rhine's western bank throughout the fall of 1944 reveal the psychological impact of confronting the barrier. Lieutenant James Carraway of the 1st Infantry Division later recalled standing on a bluff overlooking the river near Düren in early November. "We'd fought our way across France," he said. "We'd beaten them at the beaches, beaten them at the hedgerows, beaten them in the pieces, forests. We thought we were almost done. Then we saw the Rhine. The river stretched before his company like an inland sea, its far shore hazy in the autumn mist. They could see German soldiers moving freely on the eastern bank, tiny figures who occasionally stopped to wave mockingly at the Americans. Machine gun positions were clearly visible in the rubble of bombed-out riverside buildings. Artillery observers watched from church towers. It looked impossible," Carraway admitted. "Absolutely impossible. How were we supposed to get across that?" His company commander had no answer. Neither did battalion. Neither did division. The orders were simply to hold positions and wait while the staff officers back at headquarters figured out a plan. British soldiers facing the Rhine in the Netherlands sector had similar reactions. Sergeant William Thompson of the 50th Infantry Division described the river at Nijmegen in late September, just after Operation Market Garden's failure to capture. The bridge at Arnhem. "The river was wider than anything we'd trained on," he remembered. "Faster too. You could see logs and debris rushing downstream. If you fell in wearing full kit, you were dead. No question about it." Thompson's unit had been tasked with conducting reconnaissance patrols along the western bank, identifying possible crossing sites for future operations. Every site they examined had been demolished, ferry cables cut, boat landings destroyed. The Germans had even flooded some of the approach areas, creating marshlands that would slow any attacking force. "They'd thought of everything," Thompson said. "Every little advantage they could get, they'd taken it, and they had months to prepare while we were still fighting in France. We were going to cross that river, but it was going to cost us." The staff officers at Eisenhower's headquarters knew what history said about opposed river crossings. The casualty rates were horrific. At the Rapido River in Italy, January 1944, American forces had attempted to cross against German defenders. 2 regiments were essentially destroyed in less than 48 hours. suffering over 1,600 casualties for no gain. The Germans threw the survivors back across the river and held their positions. That crossing was less than 100 meters wide. The Rhine was 3 to 4 times wider. The defences were more sophisticated, the defenders more numerous. Engineers calculated that a single division crossing would require at least 5,000 assault boats to move the first wave. Each boat could carry 10 men. That meant 500 boat crews making repeated trips under fire. If the Germans achieved even 10% casualty rates per crossing trip, and historical precedents suggested they'd achieve far more, the losses would be catastrophic before the first soldier even reached the eastern shore. These calculations assumed that some boats would sink from artillery fire, some would capsize in the current, some would drift off course and land in killing zones. September turned to October, October to November. Allied armies consolidated positions along the Rhine's western approaches, but the river remained uncrossed. The strategic situation demanded a crossing. Germany's industrial capacity had to be captured or destroyed. The war had to be ended before the coming winter froze operations and gave the Germans months to rebuild their defences. But the tactical reality was unforgiving. The Rhine was the most formidable river barrier any modern army had attempted to cross against serious opposition. It had turned back the Romans. It had stopped Napoleon's enemies. Now, it stood between the Allies and final victory, and no one looking at those reconnaissance photographs or reading those casualty estimates could honestly say how they would get across without paying a price that might break even victorious armies. The question hanging over Versailles headquarters as autumn deepened wasn't whether they could cross the Rhine. The question was whether they could afford to. September 17th, 1944, Arnhem, Netherlands. British paratroopers of the 1st Airborne Division crouch in the ruins beside the northern approach to the Rhine Bridge. They've been holding this position for 3 days now, surrounded, outnumbered, running low on ammunition. German tanks prowl the streets beyond their perimeter, firing point-blank into buildings where the paratroopers have established defensive positions. The original plan called for ground forces to relieve them within 48 hours. That was 72 hours ago. Lieutenant Colonel John Frost, commanding the forces at the bridge, knows the relief isn't coming. Radio communications are spotty at best. The sounds of battle from the south, where British armour was supposed to be breaking through, have faded to silence. His men are dying to hold a bridge that leads nowhere, that will never carry the Allied advance into Germany as planned. But they hold anyway, because that's what soldiers do. Because somewhere in the chain of command, someone decided this bridge was worth any price. Because bridges intact meant divisions could cross in hours instead of weeks. Frost watches another building collapse under German tank fire. He wonders who made the calculation that a single bridge was worth this many lives. The obsession with capturing bridges intact had consumed Allied planning since the breakout from Normandy. Every demolished bridge meant days or weeks of delay, while engineers constructed temporary spans. Every bridge captured intact saved thousands of man-hours of labour and countless lives lost to exposure on improvised crossings. The mathematics were seductive. A division crossing on assault boats required 5 to 7 days to move all its elements across a major river. That same division crossing on a captured bridge could complete the movement in 12 to 18 hours. Those days mattered strategically. They meant enemy reinforcements couldn't arrive. They meant defenders couldn't establish new positions. They meant maintaining the momentum that had characterised the Allied advance since D-Day. So, as armies raced across France and Belgium in August and September 1944, the orders went out. Capture bridges intact. Take risks. Move fast. Get to the bridges before German engineers could demolish them. The rewards would justify the costs. But German demolition procedures were devastatingly effective. Wehrmacht engineers had refined their bridge destruction techniques through years of defensive warfare on the Eastern Front. Every bridge of military significance was prepared for demolition within hours of Allied forces approaching the area. The procedure was methodical and thorough. Engineers placed telemines, circular anti-tank mines weighing about 20 pounds at critical structural points. Load-bearing pillars received multiple charges. Bridge decking was laced with smaller explosives. Suspension cables were rigged to fail simultaneously. The charges were connected through redundant firing systems, electrical circuits with backup batteries, mechanical fuses with timer backups, and manual detonation stations positioned on both banks. An engineer could destroy a bridge from either end, or set it to explode automatically if Allied forces cut the firing wires. The system was nearly foolproof. Even if attackers managed to cut some demolition wires, other firing systems remained active. Even if they captured one end of the bridge, defenders at the other end could still trigger the charges. Allied combat engineers faced the impossible task of preventing these demolitions. Captain Robert Miller of the 29th Engineer Combat Battalion described attempting to save a bridge over the Moselle River in late September. His team rushed forward with the assault infantry, hoping to identify and cut demolition wires before German engineers could trigger them. "We got to the bridge approach and immediately started looking for the wires," Miller recalled. "There were dozens of them. Some were obvious, running along the bridge railings. Others were hidden in conduits or buried under debris. We started cutting everything we could find." Miller's engineers worked frantically while small arms fire cracked around them. Infantry provided covering fire while the demolition team crawled across the bridge span, cutting wires and removing charges they could reach. They worked for 7 minutes, faster than they'd ever moved in training. They found 18 separate charges and cut what they thought were all the firing wires. Then a German observer on the far shore triggered a backup circuit. "The explosion was massive," Miller said. "The center span just lifted up and collapsed into the river. Everything we'd risked, everything we'd done, meant nothing. They still got their bridge." Nijmegen represented both triumph and tragedy in the bridge obsession. September 20th, 1944. American paratroopers from the 82nd Airborne Division needed to capture the highway bridge over the Rhine River, a Rhine tributary almost as wide as the main river. British armoured forces advancing from the south depended on this bridge to continue their push toward Arnhem. Major Julian Cook was ordered to lead an assault crossing in broad daylight, using flimsy canvas boats. The paratroopers had never trained for boat operations. They were airborne infantry, not amphibious troops. But the bridge had to be taken. Cook's battalion climbed into the boats at 2:30 in the afternoon. German machine guns and artillery had perfect observation of the crossing area. The assault boats, designed to carry 13 men each, were so overloaded they sat low in the water. The current swept many boats downstream. German fire swept others like a scythe. Men fell into the water, dragged down by their equipment. Other boats reached the far shore, and paratroopers scrambled up the muddy banks into German defensive positions. The fighting was savage, close quarters combat with rifles, grenades, and bayonets. But the airborne troops fought through. They pushed the Germans back, and a small team raced for the bridge's northern end. The race to the bridge became legendary in airborne circles. Sergeant Peter Robinson and 3 other paratroopers sprinted across German positions toward the bridge approach. German defenders fired from windows and rubble piles. The Americans returned fire while running, barely slowing. They reached the bridge and immediately started searching for demolition wires. Robinson found the main electrical cable running into a concrete bunker beside the bridge approach. He pulled out his combat knife and started sawing through the insulated wire. "I didn't know if I was cutting the right wire or setting off some backup system," he later admitted. "I just knew we had to try." Another paratrooper found a secondary wire and cut it. German small arms fire intensified as defenders realized what was happening. Robinson finished cutting through the cable and looked up to see a German officer emerging from the bunker, running toward a manual detonator positioned 20 meters away. Robinson raised his rifle and fired. The German officer fell. Other paratroopers secured the bunker and found the demolition circuits. They'd been seconds away from losing the bridge. Minutes later, British tanks rolled across the intact span, continuing the advance toward Arnhem. The bridge had been saved, though at terrible cost. 48 American paratroopers dead in the crossing, over 100 wounded. But Arnhem showed the other side of the bridge obsession. Operation Market Garden's entire strategy depended on capturing a series of bridges intact, culminating with the Rhine Bridge at Arnhem. British paratroopers dropped on September 17th, expecting relief from ground forces within 2 days. The relief never came. German resistance at intermediate bridges delayed the armour. When Lieutenant Colonel Frost's battalion finally reached Arnhem Bridge and held the northern approach, they found themselves isolated deep behind enemy lines. For 4 days they held against overwhelming German counterattacks. SS Panzer divisions surrounded their positions. Artillery and tank fire reduced their defensive perimeter building by building. Ammunition ran out. Medical supplies ran out. Food ran out. The men fought with captured German weapons. They treated wounded with bandages torn from parachute silk. And still they held, because somewhere their commanders were supposed to be fighting through to relieve them. On September 21st, the fourth day of battle, German forces finally overwhelmed the surviving defenders. Of the approximately 740 men who reached the bridge, fewer than 100 escaped. Over 200 were killed. The rest captured. They'd held the bridge at catastrophic cost, and it meant nothing. The ground forces never reached Arnhem. The bridge couldn't be used. Market Garden failed. The catalogue of demolished bridges across Western Europe grew throughout the fall. American engineers documented over 300 major bridge demolitions between the Seine River and the Rhine. Each demolition represented a German success, an Allied delay, a forced river crossing that would cost time and lives. The German demolition teams worked with Teutonic efficiency. Intelligence reports indicated they'd been practicing bridge demolition since 1943, when the Wehrmacht began planning defensive operations in Western Europe. Some demolition teams could prepare a bridge for destruction in under 4 hours. Others had rigged bridges months in advance, maintaining the charges and checking the firing circuits regularly. The Germans understood that every bridge they destroyed bought time. Time for reinforcements to arrive. Time to establish new defensive positions. Time to move factories and supplies deeper into Germany. They demolished highway bridges and railroad bridges. They destroyed ancient stone bridges that had stood for centuries. They blew ferry crossings and footbridges. If it could carry troops or vehicles across water, German engineers destroyed it. Allied forces tried every tactic to capture bridges intact. Advanced patrols raced ahead of main forces, trying to reach bridges before demolition orders could be executed. Special operations teams infiltrated behind German lines to cut demolition wires or capture key bridges in surprise raids. In at least 3 instances, Allied commanders offered to allow German defenders to withdraw safely if they left bridges intact. The Germans refused every time. Combat engineers developed specialized training in bridge seizure tactics. They learned to identify demolition charges by sight, to trace firing wires under combat conditions, to disarm German fuses while under fire. They learned that speed mattered more than caution. A bridge could be repaired if partially damaged, but a fully demolished bridge was gone. They practiced cutting suspicious wires first and worrying about which circuits they'd severed later. Some engineer units suffered over 300% casualties across the campaign, losing entire platoons in bridge seizure attempts that failed when German engineers triggered demolitions anyway. By late November 1944, Allied commanders faced a brutal reality. They weren't going to capture Rhine bridges intact. The Germans were too competent, too prepared, too determined. Every major Rhine crossing had been rigged for demolition. German commanders had explicit orders to destroy bridges rather than allow their capture. Some officers had been threatened with execution for failing to demolish bridges under their responsibility. The bridge obsession had cost thousands of casualties for minimal gain. The Arnhem disaster alone killed or wounded over 17,000 Allied soldiers. Dozens of smaller bridge seizure operations had failed, with similar results: high casualties, demolished bridges, nothing gained. The conclusion was unavoidable. If the Allies were going to cross the Rhine, they'd have to do it the hard way. They'd have to build their own bridges. They'd have to conduct assault river crossings under fire, using boats and improvised equipment against prepared defences. The obsession with capturing bridges intact had to give way to the grim work of engineering and logistics. But even as commanders accepted this reality, they couldn't quite let go of the dream. Somewhere, somehow, maybe there was one bridge the Germans hadn't demolished. One bridge they could seize before the charges fired. One bridge that would change everything. That dream would prove both prophetic and devastating. October 1944. Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The United States Army Engineer School. Lieutenant Robert Hayes watches his platoon climb into assault boats for the 100th time this month. The Potomac River flows past the training grounds, cold and swift in the autumn weather. It's nothing like the Rhine, narrower, shallower, with friendly banks on both sides instead of German machine guns. But it's the best simulation available stateside. Hayes blows his whistle and the boats push off. Enlisted men row in practiced rhythm, their oars dipping and pulling in unison. The formation is perfect, textbook execution. Then Hayes fires a flare simulating German artillery. Coloured smoke billows across the water. "Casualties!" he shouts. The front boat's crew has to reorganize around their dead members. Their timing collapses. They drift sideways in the current. The boat behind them rows straight into their stern. Both boats tangle, oars clashing. Hayes shakes his head. This is calm water, daylight, no actual enemy. The Rhine will be worse in every dimension. The engineers have 7 weeks to master what seems impossible. The United States Army had been preparing for large-scale river crossings since early 1943. Doctrine officers studying German defensive capabilities on the Eastern Front concluded that major river barriers would define the campaign in Western Europe. The Rhine was obvious, but dozens of other rivers would have to be crossed. The Seine, the Moselle, the Ruhr, the Waal. Each presented unique challenges, but all shared common problems that engineering solutions had to address. First, the assault crossing itself, getting infantry across under fire. Second, the build-up phase, moving vehicles and heavy equipment across to sustain offensive operations. Third, the consolidation phase, establishing permanent bridges that could handle the massive logistics flow required by modern mechanized armies. Each phase demanded specialized equipment and training. The Army Engineer School expanded its river crossing courses from 2 weeks to 8 weeks. Training cadre were pulled from combat engineer battalions with European experience. The curriculum was comprehensive and punishing. Assault boats became the fundamental tool of river crossing operations. The Army standardized on a 13-foot plywood design, light enough for 10 men to carry, but sturdy enough to transport 12 soldiers with equipment. The boats had flat bottoms for stability and squared-off ends for easier loading. They were designed to be expendable, cheap to manufacture, simple to use, likely to be destroyed or lost during operations. By October 1944, factories were producing over 500 assault boats per week. Warehouses in England and France stockpiled thousands of them, wrapped in protective canvas and marked for specific units. The boats came with collapsible paddles, but early training revealed that paddles were nearly useless in strong currents. Engineers switched to longer oars that gave better leverage. They developed rowing techniques that kept boats straight in cross currents. They learned that 9 rowers plus 3 armed guards provided the best balance between propulsion and security. The armed guards would provide covering fire during landing, while rowers secured the boat. But assault boats had severe limitations. They moved slowly, averaging 3 to 5 miles per hour in calm water, slower in strong currents. They were highly vulnerable to artillery and machine gun fire. A single bullet hole could sink a loaded boat if it couldn't be plugged quickly. Artillery near misses created waterspouts that swamped boats or capsized them entirely. Direct hits simply obliterated boats and everyone aboard. Soldiers in assault boats couldn't return fire. Effectively, they needed both hands to row, and firing from an unstable boat was futile. The boats made obvious targets silhouetted against water. German observers could call artillery on boat formations with devastating accuracy. Engineers calculated that in a heavily opposed crossing, casualty rates for assault boat crews could reach 40 to 50%. These weren't acceptable losses, but there was no alternative for the initial assault waves. Someone had to row across under fire to establish the first foothold on the enemy shore. Storm boats offered a partial solution to the assault boats' vulnerabilities. These were German-designed 19-foot steel boats powered by outboard motors capable of carrying 12 men at speeds up to 12 miles per hour. American engineers captured examples on the Rapido River and immediately recognized their value. Storm boats crossed rivers twice as fast as assault boats, reducing exposure time to enemy fire by half. Their steel hulls resisted small arms fire better than plywood. The motors freed soldiers' hands so they could return fire during crossing. By November 1944, American factories were producing copied versions of the German design, manufacturing over 200 storm boats per week. But storm boats had their own problems. The outboard motors were noisy, eliminating any chance of surprise crossings. They required fuel, maintenance, and trained operators. Mechanical failures during crossings could leave boats dead in the water, drifting helplessly while under fire. And like assault boats, they remained vulnerable to artillery. Engineers concluded that storm boats were valuable for exploitation phases after initial crossings established fire superiority, but assault boats would still carry the first waves. The British contributed their own solution, the Buffalo. This was an American-designed landing vehicle tracked, originally developed for Pacific amphibious operations, designated LVT-4. The Buffalo looked like a boat mated with a tank, an armoured, tracked vehicle that could swim. It displaced 30 tons, carried 30 fully equipped soldiers, and drove itself out of rivers on the far shore without requiring boat ramps or recovery equipment. Its armour protected occupants from small arms and shell fragments. Its tracks gave it mobility across mud and soft ground that would bog down wheeled vehicles, and it could carry not just infantry but also crew-served weapons, light vehicles, even artillery pieces. British 21st Army Group ordered 600 Buffaloes for Rhine crossing operations. American units requested 300 more. The Buffalo represented a revolution in river crossing capability, armoured, mobile, protected. But it had limitations too. Buffaloes were slow in water, lumbering across at 5 to 6 miles per hour. They were conspicuous, impossible to hide or camouflage, their engines were loud and temperamental, maintenance was complex, and there simply weren't enough of them for every unit that needed them. The second phase of river crossing operations required different equipment, rafts and ferries to move vehicles across. Combat, engineers trained on treadway bridge pontoons, rectangular floating sections that could be linked together to form rafts. A typical vehicle raft consisted of 6 pontoons lashed together, creating a platform 40 feet long and 20 feet wide. Outboard motors pushed the rafts across rivers, or cables stretched bank to bank pulled them on a ferry system. Engineers could construct a basic vehicle raft in 30 to 40 minutes under ideal conditions. Combat conditions tripled that time. Each raft could carry a single tank or 3 trucks per trip. Engineers calculated that a single ferry crossing point could move about 20 vehicles per hour in daylight, fewer at night. To move an armoured division, 300 tanks and 2,000 wheeled vehicles required either dozens of ferry crossings operating simultaneously or days of continuous operations. Neither option was acceptable when German artillery could target ferry routes with pre-registered fire. The vehicle ferry phase represented a critical vulnerability in any crossing operation. Permanent bridging was the final challenge. The Bailey Bridge, a British modular design, became the standard solution. Bailey bridges consisted of prefabricated steel panels, each 10 feet long and 5 feet high, that bolted together to form truss structures. Engineers could assemble Bailey bridges to any required length and strength by stacking panels vertically and horizontally. A single-span Bailey bridge could support 40 tons, enough for most tanks. Double or triple stacking increased capacity to 70 or 100 tons for the heaviest armoured vehicles. The beauty of the Bailey system was its flexibility and speed. Trained engineer companies could construct a 200-foot Bailey bridge in 12 to 18 hours. The components were standardised, interchangeable, and relatively light. 3 men could carry a single panel. By late 1944, British and American factories were producing enough Bailey bridge components to construct over 5 miles of bridging per week. Stockpiles in forward areas contained thousands of panels ready for immediate use. But Bailey bridges had vulnerabilities. Construction required working in the open, exposed to artillery fire. Bridges took hours to build, even under ideal conditions. German observers could see bridge construction from kilometres away and mass artillery on construction sites. Engineers building Bailey bridges under fire suffered horrific casualty rates. Training for Rhine crossing operations intensified throughout the fall and winter of 1944. Engineer battalions practiced on every available river in England, France, and Belgium. The Meuse River near Liège became a favoured training ground. It was wide, fast, and approximated Rhine conditions in many sectors. British engineers practiced on the Thames. American units trained on French rivers still within Allied control. The training was dangerous, even without enemy opposition. Men drowned when overloaded boats capsized. Others were swept away by currents. Hypothermia killed soldiers during night training exercises in autumn's cold water. One American engineer battalion lost 15 men during a month of training crossings on the Meuse, killed in training for operations that would probably kill many more. The training revealed critical lessons. Night crossings were far harder than daylight crossings, but essential for tactical surprise. Soldiers had to practice in full equipment to understand how heavy they'd be in water. Artillery simulation had to be realistic to prepare troops for the psychological shock of crossing under fire. Communication between boat crews was nearly impossible on the water, so movements had to be pre-planned and rehearsed until automatic. By December 1944, Allied forces had assembled the largest river crossing capability in military history. Warehouses contained over 5,000 assault boats, 650 storm boats, 900 Buffalo LVTs, and enough Bailey Bridge components to span 50 miles. Engineer units had trained until river crossing procedures were muscle memory. Assault infantry had practiced loading boats, rowing techniques, and landing drills. Artillery units had rehearsed suppression fires designed to protect crossing forces. Everything was ready. The preparations were meticulous, professional, comprehensive. But no amount of training or equipment could eliminate the fundamental problem. Crossing a major river against determined opposition had to be done in phases. The first wave would cross in vulnerable boats, exposed to fire, unable to protect themselves. They'd establish a tiny foothold, probably taking heavy casualties. Follow-on waves would expand that foothold if they made it across. Only after hours or days could engineers build permanent bridges to move the armour and artillery that could decisively defeat defenders. Every phase represented a moment of terrible vulnerability where concentrated German fire could shatter the operation. The engineering problem had solutions, but those solutions couldn't guarantee success. They could only make success possible if soldiers had the courage to cross, if leaders had the will to accept the casualties, if fortune favoured the bold just long enough to get across alive. January 1945. Remagen, Germany. Feldwebel Sergeant Klaus Fischer watches American artillery shells falling on the western bank of the Rhine, 2 kilometres distant. The bombardment has been constant for 3 days, pulverising the ruins of towns the Luftwaffe already reduced to rubble during training exercises years ago. Fischer commands a machine gun position in a reinforced concrete bunker overlooking the Ludendorff railway bridge. His position is one of 73 defensive emplacements within 5 kilometres of this single bridge. Machine guns, anti-tank guns, mortars, artillery observers, all interconnected by telephone wires buried 2 meters deep to survive American counter-battery fire. The Americans will come eventually, Fischer knows. They've been coming since Normandy, pushing the Wehrmacht back kilometre by kilometre, defeat by defeat. But here, at the Rhine, the Americans will learn what real German resistance means. Behind Fischer, stretching east to the horizon, lies Germany itself. Not France, not Belgium, not occupied territory that could be traded for time. This is German soil. These are German cities the enemy wants to destroy. Fischer checks his ammunition belts again, 2,000 rounds. Carefully cleaned and loaded, he'll make every bullet count. Field Marshal Walter Model understood the Rhine's defensive significance better than any German commander. As commander of Army Group B, defending the Rhine's central sector, Model had spent months transforming the river line into a fortress complex that would have impressed Frederick the Great. Model was 54 years old in January 1945, a career officer who'd risen through defensive brilliance on the Eastern Front. Hitler called him the Führer's fireman, the general summoned whenever a desperate situation needed stabilizing. The Rhine was Model's masterpiece of defensive warfare. He positioned approximately 55 divisions behind the river, over 500,000 men, many in depleted units but still combat effective. The divisions weren't distributed evenly. Model concentrated forces at likely crossing points. The Wesel sector where British forces would probably attack, the Mainz-Mannheim area where Americans might try, the urban fortresses of Cologne and Düsseldorf. Between these concentration points, smaller units held observation posts and called in artillery from batteries positioned kilometres back from the river where American counter-battery fire couldn't reach them easily. The fortifications Model's engineers created multiplied German combat power through careful preparation. Every bend in the Rhine provided natural observation points where German spotters could see kilometres of the western bank. Church steeples in riverside towns became artillery observation posts, their stone walls thick enough to resist all but direct hits from heavy shells. The Germans flooded approach areas wherever terrain permitted, creating marshlands and swamps that channeled attackers into narrow corridors covered by pre-sighted weapons. Anti-tank ditches blocked routes where armour might support crossing attempts. Concrete bunkers, many built during the Siegfried Line construction years earlier, provided protected firing positions for machine guns and anti-tank weapons. The bunkers were mutually supporting, positioned, so each could bring fire on attackers assaulting its neighbour. Telephone wires connected every position to battery command posts. German gunners had months to pre-plot firing coordinates for every metre of the western bank and the river itself. They knew the exact range to specific trees, buildings, road junctions. They could call fire with pinpoint accuracy. The artillery concentration defending the Rhine was staggering. Intelligence estimates suggested the Germans had positioned over 1,500 artillery pieces to defend the river line. These weren't just ordinary field guns. German artillery units defending the Rhine included heavy howitzers firing 150mm shells, railway guns firing 280mm shells, and rocket artillery, the terrifying Nebelwerfer multi-barrel rocket launchers that earned the American nickname Screaming Memes for the sound of their projectiles in flight. German artillery doctrine emphasized concentration of fires. Rather than dispersing batteries along the front, German commanders positioned their guns to achieve overwhelming firepower at critical points. A single crossing attempt might draw fire from 20 or 30 batteries simultaneously, hundreds of shells falling on boats and beaches within minutes. The Germans had stockpiled ammunition for precisely this eventuality. Artillery dumps behind the Rhine contained over 2 million shells of various calibers, enough for weeks of sustained defensive fires. But Model's greatest advantage was psychological. The German soldiers defending the Rhine weren't fighting for Hitler's empire anymore, they were fighting for Germany itself. The propaganda was crude but effective. Behind the Rhine lie your homes, your families, your cities. The enemy comes to destroy Germany, to kill German women and children, to erase German culture. Every meter you trade brings the enemy closer to your homeland. Fight here or watch your country die. Many Wehrmacht soldiers had become cynical about Nazi propaganda after years of defeats and broken promises. But defending German soil tapped into deeper reserves of motivation than ideology ever could. Prisoner. Interrogations revealed that German morale, shattered by the defeats in France and the Ardennes, had recovered somewhat at the Rhine. Soldiers who'd been contemplating surrender when defending French villages found new determination when defending German cities. Volkssturm units, home guard forces composed of men too old or young for Wehrmacht service occupied many Rhine positions. These were teenagers and grandfathers with minimal training and obsolete weapons, but they were defending their literal backyards. Their effectiveness would prove variable, but their determination was real. Hitler himself declared the Rhine inviolable. In increasingly unhinged orders from his Berlin bunker, the Führer commanded that the river line be held at all costs. Wehrmacht units that withdrew across the Rhine without orders would be decimated, 1 in every 10 men executed. Officers who failed to defend Rhine positions faced court-martial and death. Not one step back had been Hitler's order at Stalingrad, and it was his order at the Rhine. Rational military judgment suggested that Germany's strategic situation was hopeless. The Soviets were advancing from the east. The Allies controlled the air completely. German industry was collapsing under round-the-clock bombing, but Hitler's orders brooked no retreat and no surrender. The Rhine would be held or German soldiers would die trying. This fanaticism trickled down through the command structure. SS units, still ideologically committed, threatened to shoot Wehrmacht soldiers who showed defeatism. Nazi Party officials behind the lines maintained lists of defeatists and cowards marked for arrest or execution. The fear of being branded a traitor sometimes outweighed the fear of Allied artillery. The Nero Decree of March 19, 1945, revealed the depths of Nazi desperation. Hitler ordered the destruction of all German infrastructure that might be useful to advancing Allied forces. Factories, bridges, railways, power plants, water systems, everything was to be demolished before capture. Albert Speer, Reich, Minister of Armaments, later testified that Hitler told him, "If the war is lost, the German nation will also perish." There is no need to take into consideration the basic needs that the people will require for continued existence. On the contrary, it is better to destroy such things ourselves. Model received these orders with dismay. Destroying Germany's infrastructure meant condemning German civilians to starvation and chaos. But the orders came from Hitler, and Wehrmacht officers who disobeyed Hitler's direct commands were executed. The Nero Decree created a terrible dilemma for commanders like Model, who still retained some sense of duty to German civilians. They could follow orders and destroy their own country, or disobey and face execution for treason. The civilian population along the Rhine experienced the war's horror in its final months. Over 200,000 German civilians were evacuated from Rhine front towns and cities in January and February 1945. Nazi officials ordered evacuations to create free fire zones where Wehrmacht units could fight without worrying about civilian casualties. But many civilians refused to leave, hiding in cellars and ruins, rather than abandoning their homes. Those who stayed witnessed the transformation of their cities into fortresses. Wehrmacht engineers demolished buildings to create fields of fire. They knocked holes through walls to create covered routes between defensive positions. They flooded basements to create water obstacles. German soldiers requisitioned food, fuel, whatever they needed from civilian stocks. The civilians who remained were trapped between armies. Allied artillery bombarded from the west. German forces prepared demolitions from the east, and everyone waited for the inevitable battle that would destroy whatever remained of the Rhine cities. German commanders understood that the Rhine defence was ultimately doomed. They couldn't stop the Allies permanently, only delay them. But delay had value. Every week the Rhine line held was another week to evacuate troops from the east, another week to move factory equipment deeper into Germany, another week to prepare defences further inland. Model's mission wasn't to win the war. It was to make the Allies pay such a high price that their advance slowed to a crawl. If Allied casualties reached a certain threshold, political pressure in Washington and London might force a negotiated settlement. It was a desperate hope, but the only hope remaining. So Model positioned his divisions, registered his artillery, and waited for the Allied crossing attempts he knew would come. He'd fought the Soviets in defensive battles that killed hundreds of thousands. He knew what rivers could do to attacking forces. The Rhine would be his Stalingrad, his masterpiece of defensive warfare. And when the Allies finally came across those 300 metres of cold water in their vulnerable boats, German guns would be waiting. The German defensive system represented the Wehrmacht's final evolution as a military force. Gone was the offensive swagger of blitzkrieg years. Gone was the confidence of racial superiority and inevitable victory. What remained was professional competence, detailed preparation, and the desperate determination of soldiers fighting with their backs against their homeland. The Rhine fortifications weren't just concrete and wire and artillery positions. They were the physical embodiment of German awareness that the war was lost, but the fighting wasn't over. Every bunker represented a decision to keep fighting. Every minefield represented a choice to make the enemy pay for every metre. Every artillery battery represented a refusal to surrender, even when surrender was the rational choice. The Allies would cross the Rhine. German commanders knew this with terrible certainty, but they'd cross into the teeth of defensive fires that would turn the river red. Model and his soldiers would make absolutely certain of that. February 1945. 21st Army Group Headquarters, Zonhoven, Belgium. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery stands before a 15-foot-long terrain model of the Rhine River crossing zone near Wesel. The model is a masterpiece of military cartography, showing every building, every elevation change, every defensive position identified by aerial reconnaissance. Coloured pins mark British divisions, Canadian divisions, artillery, batteries, engineer companies. Blue tape stretched across the model represents the Rhine itself, its width precisely to scale. Montgomery has been planning this operation for 6 weeks, studying every detail, calculating every variable. He turns to his staff officers. "Gentlemen," he says, in his clipped British accent, "the Rhine crossing will be the greatest operational task we have yet undertaken in this theatre. We will not approach it with half measures. We will not trust to luck or improvisation. We will cross with such overwhelming force that German resistance will simply collapse under the weight." His finger traces the planned crossing routes on the model. 1,250,000 men, 1,500 tanks, 5,000 artillery pieces. When we go prepared for anything. Montgomery's approach to warfare had always favoured meticulous preparation over improvisation. The son of an Anglican bishop, Montgomery had learned in the trenches of World War I that detailed planning saved lives. His victory at El Alamein in 1942 demonstrated his method. Careful accumulation of supplies, thorough training of units, overwhelming concentration of force at the decisive point, then methodical exploitation. Critics called him cautious, slow, overcautious. Montgomery called his approach professional. For the Rhine crossing, he would use the same method that had never failed him. Operation Plunder would be the largest set-piece river crossing in modern military history, so carefully planned that even the inevitable friction of combat couldn't derail it. Every contingency would be considered. Every unit would know its role. Every piece of equipment would be stockpiled in advance. Nothing would be left to chance if human preparation could prevent it. The logistics build-up for Plunder was staggering. By early March, depots behind British lines contained 60,000 tons of ammunition, enough for weeks of sustained artillery bombardment. 30,000 tons of engineering stores filled warehouses, Bailey Bridge components, assault boats, storm boats, pontoons, cables, timber, sandbags. Medical units established clearing stations with capacity for 20,000 casualties. Fuel dumps stored 5 million gallons of petroleum products. Food stocks sufficient for 1 million men for 30 days were positioned in forward areas. The build-up wasn't just massive, it was conspicuous. German reconnaissance aircraft and agents certainly reported unusual activity in the British sector. Montgomery's staff ran elaborate deception operations to confuse German intelligence about timing and exact crossing points, but the broad outline of plunder was obvious to anyone watching. Montgomery didn't care. Let the Germans know he was coming. Overwhelming force, properly applied, would prevail regardless. The assault plan itself reflected Montgomery's systematic approach. Plunder would strike along a 25-mile front between Emmerich and Wesel, hitting multiple crossing points simultaneously to prevent Germans from concentrating their defence. The assault would begin with a massive artillery preparation, the heaviest bombardment by British forces since El Alamein. 3,500 guns would fire coordinated barrages, suppressing German positions and destroying defensive installations. The barrage would lift on a precise timetable, shifting from the riverbanks to positions behind German lines. Under the cover of this artillery umbrella, assault divisions would cross the Rhine at 12 separate points. British 15th Infantry Division would cross near Xanten. British 51st Highland Division would assault at Rees. Multiple Canadian divisions would cross further north. Each division had trained for months on the specific terrain it would face, using detailed models and reconnaissance photographs. The airborne component added a dramatic dimension to plunder. Operation Varsity, a supporting operation conducted by British 6th Airborne Division and United States 17th Airborne Division, would drop 16,000 paratroopers east of the Rhine on the morning of March 24th. The airborne troops would seize the Diersvierter Wald, a forested area overlooking the Rhine that provided German artillery observers with perfect positions to direct fire on crossing sites. By capturing this terrain, the paratroopers would blind German artillery and create chaos behind German lines precisely when the river crossing was most vulnerable. Varsity represented lessons learned from Market Garden's failures. The paratroopers would drop in daylight for better accuracy. They'd drop close to friendly forces already crossing the river, allowing rapid link-up. They'd drop with overwhelming force 16,000 men in a single lift, the largest single-day airborne operation in history. Montgomery wasn't gambling on airborne forces to win the crossing alone, as Market Garden had gambled. He was using them as a component of an overwhelming combined arms assault. Training for plunder consumed British and Canadian divisions through January and February 1945. Units practiced crossing operations on the Meuse River, which approximated Rhine conditions in many sectors. Engineers rehearsed bridge construction under simulated combat conditions, working against stopwatches to improve their speed. Infantry battalions drilled boat loading until soldiers could board assault boats in darkness in less than 2 minutes. Artillery units practiced suppression fires, learning to shift their barrage with split-second timing to avoid hitting their own troops. The training killed men even without enemy opposition. 3 soldiers from the Highland Division drowned during a practice crossing when their assault boat capsized. 2 engineers died when a Bailey Bridge section collapsed during construction practice. But the training created precisely rehearsed procedures that would function automatically under combat stress. When plunder went forward, there would be no confusion about who loaded which boat, where artillery would fire, how engineer units would deploy bridging equipment. Every soldier would know his task. Montgomery's rivalry with American General George Patton added personal stakes to plunder. Patton commanded 3rd Army to the south, and he'd made no secret of his disdain for Montgomery's cautious methods. "Monty takes so long preparing that the Germans can read his plans in the newspapers," Patton reportedly said. Montgomery, for his part, regarded Patton as a reckless cowboy whose aggressive tactics wasted lives unnecessarily. The 2 generals represented opposing philosophies of warfare. Montgomery's systematic preparation versus Patton's aggressive opportunism. Both men understood that whoever crossed the Rhine first would claim victory in their personal rivalry. Montgomery scheduled plunder for March 23rd. He knew Patton was preparing his own crossing with 3rd Army. The race was on, though Montgomery refused to acknowledge it publicly. He would cross the Rhine according to his carefully crafted plan, and if Patton crossed first through some reckless gamble, so be it. Montgomery's crossing would be done properly, the British way, with minimum casualties and maximum certainty. Churchill visited Montgomery's headquarters in early March, impatient for action. The Prime Minister had watched Allied armies stall at the Rhine for months while Montgomery accumulated supplies. When? Churchill demanded. When will you cross? Montgomery, unflappable as always, walked Churchill through the terrain model. He explained the artillery plan, the crossing sites, the airborne operation. We will cross on the 23rd of March, Montgomery said, not before. The preparations must be complete. I will not send British soldiers into a river crossing that hasn't been properly prepared. Churchill, frustrated but unable to override military judgment, accepted Montgomery's timeline. The Prime Minister understood what was at stake. If plunder failed, if casualties were too high, political pressure would threaten the entire Allied strategy. The British people had endured 5 years of war. They wanted victory, but they wanted their soldiers to survive. Montgomery's promise of careful preparation offered that hope. By mid-March, everything was ready. Over 1 million soldiers were positioned in forward areas. Artillery, batteries had stockpiled ammunition until some dumps contained shells stacked 10 metres high. Engineer units had pre-positioned assault boats along the river's western bank, hidden under camouflage nets that wouldn't fool aerial reconnaissance but might obscure exact crossing points from German ground observers. Medical units stood ready to handle expected casualties, which planning estimates placed at 7,000 to 10,000 killed and wounded. Montgomery reviewed the plan one final time. It was sound, it was thorough. It would work. The Germans would resist fiercely. Intelligence suggested at least 3 divisions defending the Wesel sector, but overwhelming Allied firepower would pulverise their defences. The Rhine would be crossed. British and Canadian troops would establish bridgeheads deep enough to prevent German counterattacks from pushing them back into the river. Bailey bridges would go up within 48 hours, enabling armour to cross and exploit into Germany's industrial heartland. It was all planned, all prepared, all ready. But Montgomery knew, as every experienced officer knows, that plans survive until contact with the enemy. The Germans wouldn't behave according to British planning documents. They'd resist in unexpected ways, concentrate forces where intelligence didn't predict them, fight with desperation that comfortable staff officers in Belgium couldn't quite imagine. Plunder's success depended on British soldiers executing the plan under the worst conditions imaginable. Crossing a fast river under artillery fire, establishing positions against determined counterattacks, holding ground while engineers built permanent bridges. The plan could anticipate challenges, it couldn't eliminate them. Montgomery's systematic preparation could reduce casualties and increase the probability of success. But crossing the Rhine would still require ordinary British and Canadian soldiers to do extraordinary things. They'd have to row across 300 metres of water while shells fell around them. They'd have to assault German bunkers and clear defended buildings. They'd have to hold their positions through the terrible first night when they were most vulnerable. Montgomery had given them the best preparation possible. Now he could only wait and see if it was enough. March 10th, 1945, somewhere in the Netherlands, 20 kilometres from the Rhine. Captain Michael Thornton of the British Army's Deception Unit watches his men inflate another rubber tank. It's the 14th dummy Sherman they've positioned in this fictitious assembly area today. From the ground, the deception is obvious, rubber and plywood shaped, vaguely like an armoured vehicle. But from German reconnaissance aircraft flying at 3,000 metres, or from German observation posts across the Rhine using binoculars, these dummies look convincingly real. Thornton's unit has spent 2 weeks creating an entire phantom division in this sector, complete with fake radio traffic, simulated vehicle movement, and carefully orchestrated patterns of activity that suggest an imminent crossing attempt. The real crossing will happen 60 kilometres south. The Germans have limited reserves to defend the entire Rhine front. If Thornton's deception draws even 1 German division to the wrong sector, British troops at the actual crossing sites will face lighter resistance. Thornton positions the dummy tank and steps back. From this angle, you can see the seams in the rubber. From German positions, you see a British tank. That's all that matters. Operation Varsity was the codename for Allied deception operations supporting the Rhine crossings. Varsity built on lessons learned from earlier deception campaigns, particularly Operation Fortitude, which had convinced the Germans that D-Day landings would occur at Pas-de-Calais rather than Normandy. The Pas-de-Calais, Rhine deception faced a more complex challenge. The Germans knew Allied forces would attempt to cross the Rhine that was inevitable. The deception's goal was to confuse German intelligence about where and when those crossings would occur. Every German division positioned to defend a false crossing site was a division that wouldn't be available to oppose real crossings. every hour German commanders spent analyzing misleading intelligence was an hour they wouldn't spend preparing accurate defensive responses. Viersen operated on multiple levels simultaneously: physical deception with dummy equipment, electronic deception with false radio signals, and operational deception with feints and diversionary attacks. The physical deception was crude but effective from distance. Deception units positioned inflatable tanks, trucks, and artillery pieces in assembly areas opposite false crossing sites. They created dummy supply dumps with camouflage nets arranged to look like attempts to hide genuine stockpiles. They laid out fake communications wires and constructed phony command posts. During daylight, these installations appeared active. Personnel moved between positions. Vehicles drove prescribed routes that suggested normal military activity. At night, deception units lit carefully controlled fires and positioned lights to simulate a division preparing for operations. German aerial reconnaissance photographed these installations repeatedly. Luftwaffe photo interpreters, studying the images, saw exactly what Allied deception planners wanted them to see: major Allied forces preparing to cross at multiple points along the Rhine front. Electronic deception proved even more sophisticated. Radio operators transmitted false messages using proper encryption procedures, but on frequencies German radio intercept units monitored. The messages discussed fictional units, non-existent supply problems, imaginary postponements of crossing operations. British intelligence knew from ultra-decrypts decoded German communications that German signals intelligence was intercepting these transmissions. The radio deception created a phantom order of battle that inflated Allied strength by approximately 30 divisions. German intelligence officers, analysing the intercepts, concluded that Allied forces were preparing for crossing operations at 6 different points along a 200-kilometre front. The reality was far simpler. Montgomery's plunder would strike in one concentrated sector, but German defenders wouldn't know which sector until assault boats were already crossing. Operational deception used actual combat forces to reinforce the electronic and physical deceptions. Throughout early March, Allied artillery conducted intense bombardments of false crossing sites. Infantry patrols aggressively probed German positions opposite these sites, as if conducting reconnaissance for imminent assaults. Combat engineers were deliberately seen, operating in areas they knew. German observers watched surveying riverbanks and measuring water depths. These activities consumed real resources and risked real casualties, but they sold the deception convincingly. German commanders, watching this activity, had to position reserves to defend against what appeared to be imminent crossing attempts. Ultra-decrypts confirmed the deception's success. German intelligence reports described Allied preparations at precisely the false crossing sites Allied deception units had created. The Allied air campaign supported deception efforts by systematically degrading German intelligence capabilities in the weeks before Plunder. RAF bombers struck German radar installations along the Rhine, blinding electronic surveillance. Fighter bombers attacked German observation posts, destroying church towers and tall buildings that provided German spotters with commanding views of Allied positions. Communications centres became priority targets. By mid-March, over 90% of German telephone lines connecting Rhine front positions to higher headquarters had been severed by bombing. German commanders increasingly relied on radio communications, which Allied signals intelligence monitored continuously. The Germans were forced to communicate on channels their enemy could intercept, discussing defensive preparations that revealed their confusion about Allied intentions. Special operations added another deception layer. British SAS teams conducted raids behind German lines in the days immediately before Plunder. The raids targeted specific objectives: communication centres, artillery observation posts, supply dumps. But the raid locations were chosen partly for deception value. By striking targets in sectors far from the real crossing sites, the raids suggested Allied interest in those areas. German intelligence officers, analysing raid patterns, tried to deduce Allied intentions. Where would the British raid command posts, if not to support imminent crossing operations nearby? The SAS raids, combined with coordinated artillery strikes and increased patrol activity, created patterns that pointed German attention away from Wesel and toward false crossing zones. The deception's effectiveness depended on German assumptions about Allied operational methods. German intelligence officers had studied Montgomery's campaigns in North Africa and Western Europe. They knew Montgomery preferred thorough preparation, overwhelming force, and systematic approaches. When German reconnaissance detected massive supply buildups opposite certain Rhine sectors, German intelligence officers assumed those sectors would be crossing sites. Montgomery would cross where he'd prepared most thoroughly. The assumption was logical but wrong. Allied deception units had created false supply dumps precisely because German intelligence would interpret them as indicators of actual crossing sites. The Germans were outthinking themselves, using rational analysis to reach incorrect conclusions. But deception operations carried risks. If German intelligence penetrated the deception, if a captured prisoner revealed the truth, if aerial reconnaissance discovered the rubber tanks were fakes, the entire effort could backfire. German commanders might concentrate forces at the real crossing sites, creating precisely the defensive strength Allied planners hoped to avoid. Security for plunder became obsessive. Over 500,000 troops were moved into position for the operation, mostly at night to avoid German aerial observation. Units maintained strict radio silence when possible. Soldiers were forbidden to mention operation names or crossing locations in letters home. Military police arrested anyone found discussing operation details in public areas. The security measures created their own deception. By restricting information flow so tightly, Allied planners ensured that even if German intelligence obtained fragments of information, those fragments wouldn't reveal the complete picture. Ultra-intelligence provided real-time feedback on deception effectiveness. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park decrypted German communications throughout March, reading German intelligence assessments of Allied intentions. The decrypts revealed German confusion about crossing locations and timing. Field Marshal Model believed crossings would occur at 6 different points along Army Group B's front. He positioned reserves to respond to multiple threats, dispersing his defensive strength exactly as Allied planners hoped. Other decrypts showed German divisions being moved to defend false crossing sites, sometimes marching over 100 kilometers to positions where no Allied attack would come. Each misdirected German division represented deception success. Hundreds or thousands of German soldiers positioned uselessly while real crossing operations developed elsewhere. By March 20th, 3 days before Plunder's scheduled start, Allied deception operations reached maximum intensity. Diversionary artillery barrages hammered false crossing sites with thousands of shells, creating the impression of preparatory bombardments. RAF bombers struck German positions opposite these sites in patterns that suggested imminent ground assault. British patrol activity intensified to levels that made German commanders certain an attack was coming. And then, on March 21st, Allied activity at the false sites suddenly decreased. Patrols pulled back. Artillery fires slackened. The withdrawal was deliberate, designed to suggest that Allied forces had detected German defensive preparations and postponed crossing operations at those sites. German commanders, seeing the reduction in activity, relaxed their alert status in those sectors. Some units were actually pulled out of defensive positions to rest or refit. The deception had worked perfectly. When Montgomery's sledgehammer finally fell on March 23rd, it would strike divisions that were unprepared, positioned poorly, and unable to respond effectively because their reserves were scattered, defending ghost crossings that would never come. March 7th, 1945. 1 o'clock in the afternoon, Lieutenant Karl Timmermann leads his platoon from Company A, 27th Armoured Infantry Battalion, over a hill overlooking the town of Remagen. They've been advancing steadily for 3 days, meeting scattered resistance, mostly from demoralised German troops retreating toward the Rhine. Timmermann expects to find another demolished bridge, another barrier that will stop the American advance until engineers can build a crossing. Instead, he sees something that makes him stop breathing for a moment. The Ludendorff Railway Bridge spanning the Rhine at Remagen is still standing. Over 1,000 feet of black steel stretching across the river, intact railroad tracks still visible on the deck. Timmermann stares. Every bridge they've seen for 200 miles has been destroyed. German engineers are fanatical about demolishing bridges before American forces can capture them. This can't be real. This has to be a trap. A bridge rigged with so many explosives it'll vanish the moment Americans approach. But it's standing. Through his binoculars, Timmermann can see German soldiers and civilians on the bridge, moving toward the eastern shore. The bridge is still intact. The thought crystallizes slowly, almost too enormous to believe. They can capture a bridge across the Rhine. Timmermann's company commander, First Lieutenant Jack Grimball, reached the same conclusion simultaneously. Grimball radioed battalion headquarters, his voice tight with excitement and disbelief. "We can see a bridge over the Rhine River. and it's still standing. The response came quickly. Seize the bridge, if possible. Battalion commander ordered Timmerman's company to rush the bridge immediately before German engineers could destroy it. Timmerman organized his platoon at 1:30 p.m., less than 30 minutes after first sighting the bridge. They had no idea how many German defenders were positioned on or near the bridge. They had no knowledge of demolition preparations. They knew only that an intact Rhine bridge represented a strategic prize worth any risk. Timmerman briefed his 3 squad leaders. We're going to cross that bridge. I don't know what we'll run into. Just keep your men moving. Don't stop. Don't bunch up. If the bridge blows while we're on it, at least some of us might make it. The approach to the bridge ran through Remagen's ruined streets. American artillery and airstrikes had pounded the town for days. Buildings were collapsed shells. Rubble blocked most streets. Timmerman's platoon moved by squads, using infantry tactics that had become second nature after months of combat. They encountered scattered German resistance, a machine gun firing from a cellar, a few rifle shots from upper-story windows. The Americans suppressed each position with rifle and machine gun fire, then moved forward. The resistance was token, disorganized. Most German troops in Remagen were retreating, not defending. But as Timmerman's platoon approached the bridge's western approach, German fire intensified. Wehrmacht engineers and infantry defending the bridge realized Americans were coming. The question was whether they'd blow the bridge before Americans reached it. German Captain Willy Bratke commanded the bridge defenses, and he was in an impossible situation. His orders were explicit: hold the bridge as long as possible to allow German forces to retreat across the Rhine, then destroy it before American capture. Bratke had approximately 350 soldiers, a mixture of combat engineers, infantry, Volkssturm, and anti-aircraft crews. The bridge had been rigged for demolition weeks earlier. Electrical charges were positioned on the bridge's stone towers and along its steel superstructure. Backup charges were placed at critical load-bearing points. The firing mechanism was tested regularly. Everything was ready. But Bratke faced a timing problem. German soldiers and civilians were still crossing eastward, retreating from American advance. If he detonated too early, he'd trap German forces west of the Rhine. If he waited too long, Americans might reach the bridge before he could trigger the charges. At 2 p.m., Bratke received reports that American infantry was approaching through Remagen. He ordered the bridge cleared of all personnel except the demolition team. At 2:15 p.m., Timmerman's platoon reached the western end of the bridge. They could see the bridge's full length now, a massive steel structure with 2 stone towers on the western shore and 2 on the eastern shore. Railroad tracks ran down the center. Wooden planking created a roadway for vehicles. The bridge looked ancient, solid, permanent. It also looked like the perfect kill zone. The bridge offered no cover. Anyone crossing would be completely exposed to German fire from the eastern shore. Timmerman could see German soldiers on the far side, moving frantically. He knew those movements meant the Germans were preparing to demolish. There was no time for elaborate planning. Timmerman turned to his platoon. Let's go. At 2:20 p.m., American infantry began crossing the Ludendorff Bridge under fire. The crossing became a race between American determination and German demolition. Timmerman led from the front, running across the wooden planking, while German machine gun fire cracked around him. Bullets hit the steel girders with metallic clangs. Soldiers behind Timmerman spread out, trying to present less concentrated targets. Some men hugged the bridge's steel framework, using girders for cover. Others ran straight across, figuring speed was better than cover. Engineer Sergeant Eugene Dorland and 3 other engineers ran ahead of the infantry, searching desperately for demolition wires they could cut. They found wires running along the bridge's framework and started cutting everything they could reach with wire cutters and knives. No one knew which wires were critical, which were decoys, which controlled which charges. They cut everything and hoped. At 2:25 p.m., the bridge shuddered. A massive explosion erupted from the western towers. The Germans had triggered the demolition charges, but the bridge didn't collapse. The explosion was enormous. Dust and smoke billowed across the structure. Debris flew into the river. The concussion knocked some American soldiers flat. For a moment, everyone thought the bridge was gone. Then the smoke cleared. The bridge was still standing. The western towers were damaged, chunks of masonry blown away. The steel superstructure was twisted in places. But the main span held. The railroad tracks were bent but still connected. The bridge's fundamental structure had survived the German demolition. Later investigation revealed that German engineers had used inadequate explosives either through supply shortages or miscalculation, and the charges had damaged but not destroyed the critical load-bearing elements. The partial demolition failed to drop the bridge. It remained crossable, barely damaged, but intact. Timmerman's platoon didn't wait to analyze why the bridge survived. They kept moving. By 2:30 p.m., American soldiers reached the eastern towers. They found the German demolition team still there, stunned that their charges had failed. A brief firefight erupted at point-blank range. The Americans killed several German engineers and captured the rest. By 2:45 p.m., Timmerman's platoon was across the Rhine and moving inland, establishing a tiny perimeter on the eastern shore. Other American units poured across the damaged bridge. Within 30 minutes, over 120 American soldiers were across. By 3:30 p.m., over 500 Americans had crossed. By nightfall, 5,000 American troops had crossed the Rhine at Remagen, the first Allied soldiers across the Rhine in strength since the war began. The German reaction was immediate and catastrophic for Captain Brach. Hitler, informed that Americans had captured an intact Rhine bridge, flew into a rage. "This is the greatest disgrace in German military history," he screamed at his staff. He ordered immediate counterattacks to recapture the bridge, regardless of cost. He ordered V2 rockets to target the bridge, the first and only time the Nazis used their ballistic missiles against a tactical target. He ordered the Luftwaffe to destroy the bridge with suicide attacks. And he ordered Captain Bratgay and his demolition team arrested, court-martialed, and executed. Bratgay was captured by Americans a few days later, ironically saving his life. The Germans shot his deputy and several engineers in absentia. Hitler's rage revealed how strategically important the Remagen Bridge was. A single intact bridge had created a gap in the Rhine defense that could collapse Germany's entire defensive strategy. The Americans understood their prize's value. 9th Armored Division and supporting units poured everything they had across the Remagen Bridge. Engineers immediately began repairs, shoring up damaged sections and strengthening the structure to carry heavy vehicles. Pontoon bridges were started alongside the railway bridge as backups. But the Ludendorff Bridge itself became the focus of German counterattacks unlike anything American forces had experienced. German artillery hammered the bridge with up to 2,000 shells per day. Luftwaffe fighters and fighter bombers attacked despite overwhelming American air superiority, losing dozens of aircraft in suicide runs. V2 ballistic missiles fell on Remagen, some coming within meters of the bridge. German frogmen swam downstream with explosives, trying to blow the bridge's supports underwater. Every attack failed or caused only minor damage. The bridge held for 10 critical days. During those 10 days, over 25,000 American troops and thousands of vehicles crossed into Germany. The bridgehead expanded from 500 meters to over 10 kilometers deep. German reserves rushed to contain the Remagen crossing were unavailable to defend against other crossing attempts being prepared elsewhere. A single captured bridge had changed the entire strategic situation. On March 17th, at 3 p.m., 10 days after its capture, the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed. Continuous German artillery fire, structural damage from the failed demolition, and the enormous weight of military traffic had weakened the bridge beyond its capacity. The center span gave way with a groaning screech of tortured metal. 28 American engineers working on the bridge fell with it into the Rhine, most drowned, trapped under the wreckage. But by then the bridge had served its purpose. Multiple pontoon bridges were already operational at Remagen. The bridgehead was firmly established, defended by 3 American divisions. The Rhine barrier had been breached. Remagen proved that the Rhine wasn't invincible, that German defences could be broken, that Allied forces could get across and stay across. The miracle at Remagen, and it was a miracle, the only intact bridge captured along the entire Rhine, changed Allied strategy and shattered German morale. One bridge, one moment of German failure. One lieutenant brave enough to rush across, despite the risks. It was the pivot point of the Rhine crossing campaign. March 8th, 1945. Dawn breaks over the Remagen bridgehead. Lieutenant Timmerman's platoon has spent the night digging foxholes in German soil, the first Allied combat infantry to hold positions east of the Rhine. They're exhausted, none of them slept more than an hour. German artillery fire continued through the night, shells falling randomly across the tiny American perimeter. At first light, Timmerman surveys their situation. His platoon has expanded into a company-sized perimeter roughly 1,000 meters deep and 2,000 meters wide. Other American units crossed during the night and established positions on both flanks. Behind them, the Ludendorff Bridge is crowded with troops and vehicles crossing eastward. Engineers are working frantically to repair damaged sections and strengthen the structure. Ahead, through the morning mist, Timmerman can see German forces gathering. Tanks, infantry, artillery being positioned. The Germans are going to counterattack. Probably soon. Definitely hard. The Americans have a bridgehead. Now they have to hold it against everything the Wehrmacht can throw at them. The strategic importance of the Remagen bridgehead became clearer with each passing hour. First Army Commander General Courtney Hodges immediately ordered maximum exploitation. 9th Armoured Division was reinforced with 2 more infantry divisions by March 8th. By March 9th, 4 divisions were feeding troops across the Remagen bridges, the damaged but still functioning Ludendorff, plus 2 pontoon bridges erected overnight by combat engineers. The bridgehead expanded rapidly. American troops pushed east and north, capturing the towns of Honnef and Rheinbreitbach. The initial perimeter of 1 kilometer ballooned to 5 kilometers by March 9th, 7 kilometers by March 10th. But expansion came at a cost. Every meter gained put American troops further from their supply lines and artillery support, while bringing them closer to German reserves assembling for counterattacks. German command realized the Remagen bridgehead represented a strategic catastrophe. Model's Army Group B had positioned forces to defend against crossings at predicted locations, Wesel in the north, Mainz in the south. Remagen was, between these sectors, defended by second-rate troops who were supposed to retreat, demolish bridges, and delay Americans until the Rhine defense could be organized. The capture of an intact bridge at Remagen created a penetration that threatened to unravel Model's entire defensive scheme. Hitler's orders were unambiguous: destroy the Remagen bridgehead, regardless of cost. Model began stripping units from other sectors and rushing them toward Remagen. The 11th Panzer Division, refitting in rear areas, received orders to counterattack immediately. The 9th Panzer Division was pulled from defensive positions along the Ruhr and sent to Remagen. Volkssturm units, artillery, batteries, anything with weapons, Model threw at the bridgehead. The first serious German counterattack came on March 9th. Elements of 11th Panzer Division, approximately 40 tanks supported by 2 infantry battalions, attacked the northern shoulder of the bridgehead near Egedienburg. The German tanks appeared through morning fog around 7 a.m. Their approach masked until they were within 1,000 meters of American positions. American infantry had no significant anti-tank weapons in forward positions. The heavy weapons were still crossing the bridges. The soldiers did what infantry always does when facing tanks without anti-tank guns. They held their positions and called for artillery. American artillery batteries west of the Rhine responded within minutes. Forward observers directed fire on the German armour with devastating accuracy. High explosive shells bracketed the panzers. Some tanks took direct hits and erupted in flames. Others retreated under the barrage. But some kept coming. German tanks rolled into American foxhole lines, machine guns firing, high explosive shells blasting infantry positions at point-blank range. The fighting at Egedienburg became intimate and brutal. Private First Class James Davis, armed only with a rifle and 2 grenades, watched a German tank grind toward his foxhole. The tank commander's hatch was open. Wehrmacht doctrine called for tank commanders to fight with hatches open for better visibility despite the vulnerability. Davis waited until the tank was 15 meters away, then threw his first grenade. It bounced off the tank's sloped armor and exploded harmlessly. Davis threw his second grenade. This one flew through the open hatch. The explosion inside the tank killed the crew instantly. The tank rolled to a stop 5 meters from Davis's foxhole. Davis survived, but dozens of other American infantry weren't as fortunate or lucky. German tanks crushed foxholes. Machine gun fire cut down soldiers trying to retreat. The counterattack penetrated 600 meters into American lines before being stopped by concentrated artillery fire, and the arrival of American tank destroyers rushed forward from the bridges. The battle for the bridgehead settled into a grinding attrition that continued for 10 days. German forces launched counterattacks daily, sometimes multiple times per. American forces expanded the perimeter incrementally, fighting for every hilltop and village. Casualties mounted on both sides. American units in the bridgehead suffered over 5,000 killed and wounded in the first week. German casualties were higher. Estimates suggested over 8,000 German soldiers killed or wounded trying to eliminate the bridgehead. The fighting was continuous and exhausting. Artillery fire fell on both sides almost constantly. German observers on high ground east of the bridgehead could see most American positions and called artillery on any movement. American counter-battery fire suppressed some German guns but couldn't eliminate them all. Soldiers on both sides learned to live in a landscape of constant shelling, where survival depended on good foxholes and better luck. The Ludendorff Bridge itself became the focus of German artillery and air attacks. Wehrmacht gunners targeted the bridge around the clock. Over 70 artillery batteries, approximately 400 guns, were eventually positioned to fire on the bridge and its approaches. Shells fell in such density that American engineers working on bridge repairs suffered casualty rates approaching 40%. Every few hours, a shell would score a direct hit on the bridge structure, damaging beams or punching holes in the deck. Engineers worked continuously to repair damage, often while under fire. They welded steel plates over shell holes. They replaced damaged support beams. They shored up weakened sections with timber and steel reinforcement. The bridge became a patchwork of repairs, each section representing an engineer's courage and skill under fire. Luftwaffe attacks on the Remagen Bridge represented some of the war's last significant German air operations. Luftwaffe fighters and fighter bombers, pulled from other fronts and fueled with the last reserves of aviation gasoline, struck the bridge repeatedly. German pilots flew through intense American anti-aircraft fire. Over 600 anti-aircraft guns were positioned around Remagen by March 10th. The flak was so dense that some German pilots compared it to the worst flak over England during the Battle of Britain. Luftwaffe losses were catastrophic. American fighters patrolled constantly over the bridgehead, shooting down German aircraft before they could reach targets. Anti-aircraft guns destroyed dozens more. In 1 week of attacks, the Luftwaffe lost over 100 aircraft trying to destroy the Remagen bridges. The attacks achieved minimal damage. A few bombs hit the bridge without causing structural failure, but the Luftwaffe's effort revealed German desperation. They were expending irreplaceable aircraft and pilots for virtually no gain. The most unusual German attack came from underwater. Wehrmacht combat engineers organized frogman teams equipped with demolition charges. The plan was simple. Frogmen would swim downstream to the bridge, dive beneath it, and attach explosive charges to the support pillars. The first frogman attack came on the night of March 10th. 7 German swimmers entered the Rhine upstream from Remagen, each carrying waterproof demolition charges. American guards on the bridge heard splashing and opened fire. Searchlights swept the water. Machine guns fired at anything moving in the river. 6 of the 7 frogmen were killed. The 7th was captured. His interrogation revealed the plan, and American engineers immediately installed anti-frogman defenses, nets stretched underwater to entangle swimmers, electrical sensors to detect movement, depth charges dropped randomly to deter underwater approaches. Subsequent frogman attempts failed with similar losses. The Germans were throwing everything at Remagen: artillery, armor, aircraft, frogmen, and achieving nothing except casualties. By March 15th, the bridgehead was 15 kilometers deep and 30 kilometers wide. Over 60,000 American troops occupied positions east of the Rhine. Bailey bridges and pontoon bridges supplemented the damaged Ludendorff Bridge. American engineers had built 4 additional bridges, all functioning, all carrying heavy traffic. The bridgehead had become a permanent penetration of the Rhine defense. German forces, unable to eliminate it through counterattacks, shifted to a containment strategy. Model positioned over 98,000 troops in an arc around the bridgehead, trying to prevent further expansion. But containing the bridgehead meant those 98,000 troops weren't available to defend against other Allied crossing operations being prepared elsewhere. Remagen had become a strategic magnet, drawing German forces to defend against a threat that couldn't be eliminated. First Army used the bridgehead exactly as strategic logic dictated, as a platform for future offensives and as a diversion that pinned German reserves. The human cost of holding Remagen bridgehead was staggering. Medical clearing stations west of the Rhine processed thousands of casualties daily. Wounded men were evacuated across the bridges, often under artillery fire. Ambulances drove through shell bursts. Medics treating wounds while the vehicles bounced over damaged bridge decking. Some ambulances took direct hits and were destroyed with their wounded passengers. The casualty rate in bridgehead units exceeded sustainable levels. Some rifle companies lost over half their strength in a week of fighting. Replacements arrived and were committed to combat within hours, many dying before they'd learned their squad mates' names. The fighting wasn't dramatic or heroic in the way movies portray combat. It was grinding, exhausting attrition. Soldiers lived in muddy foxholes, cold and wet, eating when they could, sleeping in brief intervals between artillery barrages and counterattacks. They aged years in days. When the Ludendorff Bridge finally collapsed on March 17th, it was almost a relief. The bridge had become a symbol, a target that drew German fire like a magnet. Its collapse meant German artillery would shift to other targets, the pontoon bridges, the supply routes, the troop concentrations. But by then, the bridge had served its purpose. It had allowed the Bridgeheads' establishment. It had drawn German reserves into a battle they couldn't win. It had proved the Rhine could be crossed and held. The 28 engineers who died in the collapse were buried with military honours. They'd given their lives maintaining a bridge that had already won the strategic victory it was needed for. The Remagen bridgehead remained secure, growing stronger daily, preparing for the breakout that would come when other Allied forces crossed the Rhine and Model's defences finally shattered completely. March 22nd, 1945, 10 p.m, Oppenheim, Germany. The Rhine flows dark and swift past the town's ruins. General George S. Patton stands on the river bank, binoculars raised, studying the eastern shore. His Third Army has reached the Rhine along a 50-kilometre front, but Patton isn't interested in the whole front. He's interested in Oppenheim, specifically obsessively interested. The river is 300 metres wide here. The current strong but not impossible. German defences on the eastern shore appear light. Aerial reconnaissance suggests Volkssturm units and scattered Wehrmacht remnants, nothing like the concentration defending other sectors. Patton has been planning this crossing for weeks, preparing in secret, telling almost no one. Not because High Command would disapprove, but because Patton wants to cross before Montgomery's massive Operation Plunder scheduled for March 23rd. Patton wants to be first across the Rhine. Not first American, that honour went to the lucky bastards at Remagen, but first in a planned, deliberate assault crossing. First to prove that speed and audacity matter more than Montgomery's ponderous preparations. Tomorrow night, Patton tells his staff, we cross tomorrow night. No postponements, no delays. Montgomery can have his set-piece battle. I'll already be across. Patton had been chafing since Remagen proved the Rhine was crossable. First Army's accidental capture of the Ludendorff Bridge meant Patton wouldn't be first across the Rhine overall. But he could still be first in a planned assault crossing, first to demonstrate that American offensive spirit could achieve what British caution required weeks to prepare. Third Army's advance to the Rhine had been characteristically aggressive. While other Allied armies paused to consolidate logistics and prepare for set-piece crossings, Patton pushed forward relentlessly. His troops reached the Rhine near Koblenz on March 7th, the same day Remagen fell. Patton immediately ordered reconnaissance of crossing sites. Engineers surveyed river conditions. Intelligence officers analysed German defensive positions. Patton personally studied maps and aerial photographs, looking for the perfect crossing point, somewhere the Germans were weak, somewhere his forces could cross before German reserves could counterattack. Oppenheim seemed perfect for Patton's purposes. The town was small, relatively undamaged by bombing, sitting on a slight bend in the Rhine that provided some concealment from German observation posts upstream and downstream. More importantly, German defences at Oppenheim were weak. Intelligence suggested the sector was held by Volkssturm and remnants of Wehrmacht units destroyed in earlier fighting. No panzer divisions nearby. No heavy artillery concentrations. The Germans had focused their Rhine defences on more obvious crossing points opposite Mainz, opposite Mannheim. Oppenheim was a backwater, important to no one except Patton. He assigned 5th Infantry Division to make the assault. The division was veteran-blooded in combat across France and Germany, led by officers who understood Patton's preference for speed over caution. Patton briefed Division Commander Major General Stafford Leroy Irwin personally, cross on the night of March 22nd, establish a bridgehead, expand rapidly, no elaborate preparations. No massive artillery bombardment that would alert every German within 50 kilometres, just get across fast and violently. The secrecy surrounding Patton's crossing attempt was extraordinary. Third Army staff, limited knowledge to essential personnel only. Units were briefed on the operation only hours before execution. Radio traffic was kept to minimum to avoid alerting German signals intelligence. Patton forbade any large-scale troop movements that might be observed by German reconnaissance. The assault units moved into position on March 22nd in small groups, using roads parallel to the river to avoid being silhouetted against the water. Assault boats were brought forward, hidden under camouflage nets in truck beds. Artillery batteries repositioned carefully, 1 or 2 guns at a time, to avoid creating patterns that German observers might detect. Everything was low-key, quiet, invisible if possible. Patton wasn't trying to hide that Third Army would cross the Rhine eventually. That was inevitable. He was hiding where and when. At 10 p.m. on March 22nd, assault boats carrying the 5th Infantry Division's first wave pushed into the Rhine at Oppenheim. There was no preliminary artillery bombardment, no airstrikes, no diversions, just infantry and boats rowing across in darkness as quietly as possible. The silence was eerie. Soldiers expected German artillery fire, machine guns, illumination flares. Instead, they heard only the splash of oars and the rush of current. The eastern shore grew closer. Still no German fire. Some soldiers whispered that it was a trap, that the Germans were waiting to open fire at point-blank range. Others thought German defenders had simply abandoned this sector. At 10:20 p.m., the first boats grounded on the eastern shore. Infantrymen jumped out, waded through shallow water, and scrambled up the muddy bank. Still no fire. They advanced inland 50 metres, 100 metres, establishing a shallow perimeter. Behind them, more boats crossed. By 10:45 p.m., over 200 American soldiers were across. By 11:30 p.m., over 1,000 were across. By midnight, 3,000 American infantry occupied positions 2 kilometres deep on the Rhine's eastern shore. The German reaction, when it finally came, was confused and ineffective. Wehrmacht units holding the Oppenheim sector had been depleted by earlier fighting and demoralised by continuous retreat. Many defensive positions were held by Volkssturm, old men and teenagers with rifles and Panzerfausts, but little training or motivation. When American infantry attacked German bunkers and strongpoints, resistance was sporadic. Some positions fought briefly then surrendered. Others were abandoned before Americans reached them. German artillery fire, when it started around 1 a.m. on March 23rd, was uncoordinated and limited. The Germans had few artillery pieces in the sector, and those they had lacked ammunition for sustained bombardment. American casualties in the crossing's first 6 hours were remarkably light, 34 killed, approximately 100 wounded. Compared to the thousands killed at other river crossings, Oppenheim was almost bloodless. Patton received news of the successful crossing at 3 a.m. on March 23rd. His reaction was characteristic, immediate, profane, gleeful. He telephoned 12th Army Group Commander Omar Bradley. "Brad, don't tell anyone, but I'm across." Bradley, half asleep, asked where. "The Rhine." Patton said, "I sneaked a division over last night. I'm across the Rhine and nobody's raising hell about it. Do you want me to give it back?" Bradley laughed and congratulated him. Then Patton added, "Make sure Monty knows I crossed the Rhine before his big operation kicks off. The dig at Montgomery was intentional." Patton had been arguing for months that aggressive action was more effective than Montgomery's methodical approach. Oppenheim seemed to prove Patton right. His division crossed the Rhine in hours with minimal casualties, while Montgomery was still moving into position for plunder. By dawn on March 23rd, 5th Infantry Division had established a bridgehead 3 kilometres deep and 5 kilometres wide. Combat engineers began constructing the first pontoon bridge at 6 a.m. They worked in daylight, protected by American air superiority and limited German artillery. The first pontoon bridge was operational by 2 p.m., less than 16 hours after the first infantry crossed. Armour and vehicles began crossing immediately. By nightfall on March 23rd, over 10,000 American troops and 200 armoured vehicles were across at Oppenheim. The bridgehead expanded to 5 kilometres deep. German counterattacks were weak and poorly coordinated local Volkssturm units attacking with no armour or artillery support, easily repulsed by American infantry with tank support. The crossing was succeeding beyond Patton's most optimistic projections. Patton made sure the world knew about Oppenheim. He invited journalists to visit the bridgehead on March 24th. Newsreel cameras filmed American tanks rolling across pontoon bridges. Patton gave quotes designed for headlines. "The Rhine crossing? Nothing to it. Our men went across like they were crossing the Chickahominy back home." The comparison to an American creek was deliberate hyperbole, but it served Patton's narrative. While Montgomery required 1 million men and 5,000 guns for plunder, Patton crossed with one division and minimal artillery. The American press loved the story. Aggressive American general outflanks cautious British general, proves American methods superior. The British press was less amused. Churchill, visiting Montgomery's headquarters, when news of Patton's crossing broke, reportedly said nothing but looked displeased. Montgomery himself refused to comment publicly, but his staff officers muttered about glory-seeking and unnecessary risks. The military reality was more complex than Patton's publicity suggested. Oppenheim succeeded partly because Patton chose his crossing point brilliantly. The sector was genuinely weak. German forces in the area were third-rate, undersupplied, and demoralized. A crossing opposite stronger defences would have met resistance, similar to Remagen or worse. Patton also benefited from timing. By late March 1945, German defensive capabilities had degraded significantly. Fuel shortages limited German tank operations. Artillery ammunition was rationed. Communications were disrupted. Air defence was nearly non-existent. Patton crossed at a moment when even well-defended sectors would struggle to resist determined assault. His success owed much to excellent tactical judgment, but also to strategic conditions that made any Rhine crossing more achievable than it would have been months earlier. Nevertheless, Oppenheim demonstrated that methodical preparation wasn't always necessary. Patton crossed the Rhine with minimal casualties, using the minimum force required for the mission. His approach accepted risks that Montgomery's doctrine rejected. What if German defences had been stronger? What if German reserves had counterattacked before the bridgehead could be established? What if the current had scattered assault boats? Patton gambled that speed and surprise would overcome defensive advantages. At Oppenheim, the gamble paid off. But military history remembers successful gambles as brilliant strokes of genius, while forgetting the failed gambles that destroyed units and killed thousands. Patton's crossing was both a brilliant exploitation of enemy weakness and a calculated risk that happened to work. Within 48 hours, Third Army had 3 divisions across the Rhine at Oppenheim. The bridgehead became a jumping-off point for the advance into southern Germany. Patton had his victory, his headlines, and his personal satisfaction of beating Montgomery across the Rhine. History would argue forever about whether his method or Montgomery's was superior. The only certainty was that both methods got Allied forces across the Rhine, and both contributed to Germany's final defeat, March 23, 1945, 9 p.m. The western bank of the Rhine, near Wesel, Germany. Bombardier James Mitchell of the Royal Artillery stands beside his 25-pounder field gun, one of 3,500 artillery pieces positioned along a 25-mile front. He's been waiting for this moment since early morning, when his battery moved into position. The gun is loaded. Coordinates are set. Every gun in 21st Army Group is aimed at pre-plotted German positions across the Rhine. Mitchell checks his watch. 9 p.m. exactly. His battery commander raises his arm, then drops it. Fire. The gun roars, its muzzle flash brilliant in the darkness. 3 seconds later, Mitchell hears the sound he'll remember for the rest of his life. The simultaneous thunder of thousands of guns firing together. The barrage is so intense that the ground shakes like an earthquake. The night sky lights up as if dawn arrived 6 hours early. Across the Rhine, German positions disappear under a storm of high explosive that turns the eastern shore into an erupting volcano. Mitchell reloads mechanically, fires again, reloads, fires. The gun barrel grows hot under his hands. This is Montgomery's sledgehammer. This is overwhelming force, made manifest. The artillery preparation for Operation Plunder was the heaviest bombardment British forces had conducted since El Alamein in 1942. Montgomery's gunners had calculated that suppressing German defences required saturating every suspected position with high explosive. The bombardment plan divided into phases, each targeting different defensive zones. Phase 1, 9 p.m. to 10 p.m, targeted German frontline positions, bunkers, trenches, machine gun nests within 1,000 metres of the Rhine's eastern bank. Phase 2, 10 p.m. to 11 p.m, targeted German artillery positions, ammunition dumps, and command posts 2 to 5 kilometres behind the river. Phase 3, 11 p.m. to midnight, targeted German reserves, road junctions, and assembly areas where counterattack forces might gather. The bombardment wasn't random. Every gun fired at coordinates plotted weeks in advance based on aerial reconnaissance, intelligence reports, and captured German maps. Forward observers had registered targets during the previous days, adjusting fire to ensure accuracy. When the barrage began, German defenders experienced what they'd inflicted on other armies for years: terror of being on the receiving end of overwhelming firepower. At midnight, the artillery barrage shifted according to timetable. Guns stopped firing at riverbank positions and concentrated on targets further inland. This was the signal. Assault boats carrying British and Canadian infantry pushed into the Rhine at 12 crossing points simultaneously. The scale was staggering. Over 1,000 assault boats hit the water within 10 minutes, carrying 12,000 men in the first wave. Storm boats with outboard motors churned across at higher speed, their engines roaring over the diminished artillery fire. Buffaloes, the tracked amphibious vehicles, crawled into the water and swam across like steel alligators, their passengers protected by armour plating. The Rhine surface became crowded with crossing traffic, boats arranged in disciplined waves separated by precise time intervals. Montgomery's staff had choreographed the crossing with military precision. Every boat knew its landing zone. Every unit knew its objective. There was no confusion, no improvisation. This was industrial warfare. Human courage, organised and directed by systematic planning. Private Thomas Wilson of the 15th Scottish Division climbed into his assault boat at 12:05 a.m. on March 24th. His boat carried 11 other infantrymen plus the engineer crew manning the oars. Wilson's hands shook as he gripped his rifle. This was his first combat river crossing. Training exercises on the Meuse hadn't prepared him for the reality. The Rhine was wider, faster, darker than training rivers. German artillery was starting to respond to the crossing. Shells fell into the water, creating geysers that rocked nearby boats. Tracer fire from German machine guns streaked across the river like deadly fireflies. The boat rocked violently as engineer oarsmen pulled with desperate rhythm. Wilson wanted to make himself smaller, to disappear into the boat's bottom. But there was nowhere to hide. The eastern shore drew closer with agonizing slowness. 200 meters. 150. A shell exploded 20 meters to the left, drenching the boat with Rhine water. Wilson tasted metal in his mouth, fear, or the chemical residue of explosives. He couldn't tell which. 100 meters. 50. The boat ground onto mud and gravel. Out! Out! Move! The sergeant was shouting. Wilson stumbled over the boat's side into knee-deep water, waded to shore, and ran up the muddy bank into hell. The fighting on the eastern shore varied wildly by location. Some crossing points met fierce resistance. German defenders, protected in concrete bunkers that survived the artillery barrage, poured machine gun and mortar fire into landing zones. British infantry took casualties crossing exposed ground from riverbank to the first cover. Other crossing points met minimal resistance, German defenders either killed by the barrage or shocked into surrender by its intensity. Lieutenant Colonel Derek Mills Roberts led No. 4 Commando ashore at Wessel and found German defenders emerging from bunkers with hands raised, too stunned to fight. Other units weren't as fortunate. The 51st Highland Division, crossing at Rees, met determined resistance from German paratroopers occupying fortified buildings. The fighting devolved into house-to-house combat, room by room clearing operations that cost casualties on both sides. The German defenders fought with the desperation of men protecting their homeland. Oberleutnant First Lieutenant Heinrich Becker commanded a Wehrmacht infantry company defending positions near Bislich. His company had been battered by the artillery barrage. 3 of his 4 platoons were out of communication, probably destroyed or dispersed. But Becker's remaining platoon occupied a concrete bunker that survived the shelling. When British boats approached his sector, Becker's machine gunners opened fire with disciplined bursts. They could see boats silhouetted against the water, perfect targets. The first boat in the British wave took direct machine gun hits and sank within meters of shore. The second boat veered away, its crew panicked. The third boat landed, but half its passengers were hit before reaching cover. Becker's platoon held its position for 3 hours, inflicting over 60 British casualties before being overrun by commandos who flanked the bunker and assaulted it with grenades and flamethrowers. Becker survived and was captured. In prisoner interrogation, he expressed no regret. "We were defending Germany," he said simply. "What else could we do?" By 3 a.m. on March 24th, British and Canadian forces had established bridgeheads at all 12 crossing points. The bridgeheads varied in size. Some were only 500 metres deep, others extended 2 kilometres inland, but all had sufficient depth to protect the riverbank crossing sites from direct German fire. Combat engineers immediately began constructing pontoon bridges and Bailey bridges. The engineering effort was as massive as the infantry assault. Over 10,000 engineer troops worked through the night, assembling bridge components under sporadic German artillery fire. The first pontoon bridge became operational at Xanten at 4:30 a.m., less than 5 hours after the first infantry crossed. By dawn, on March 24th, 6 bridges were operational. Armoured vehicles began crossing immediately. Tanks, self-propelled artillery, armoured personnel carriers. The second wave of infantry crossed in buffaloes and on the new bridges, expanding the bridgeheads and relieving first wave units who'd been fighting continuously since midnight. Operation Varsity, the airborne component of Plunder, launched at 10 a.m. on March 24th. This was the largest single-day airborne operation in history. Over 16,000 paratroopers from British 6th Airborne Division and United States 17th Airborne Division, dropping in broad daylight east of the Rhine. The drop zones were immediately adjacent to the river crossings, close enough that ground forces could link up with airborne forces within hours. This was a critical lesson from Market Garden: drop airborne forces close to friendly troops to enable rapid link-up and mutual support. The airborne armada was massive. Over 1,700 transport aircraft and 1,300 gliders filled the sky over the Rhine. German anti-aircraft fire was intense. Flak batteries that survived the artillery barrage fired continuously at the low-flying transports. Dozens of aircraft were hit, some exploded in mid-air. Others crashed in flames, their paratrooper passengers killed before reaching the ground. But the sheer number of aircraft overwhelmed German defences. Most paratroopers landed successfully in their designated drop zones. Corporal Richard Klein of the 17th Airborne jumped from his C-47 transport at 1,000 feet over the Dyersfelder Wald. The forest was supposed to be his drop zone, but crosswinds scattered his stick of paratroopers. Klein landed in an open field 300 metres from the forest. He hit hard, the impact driving air from his lungs. Training took over. He released his parachute harness, grabbed his carbine, and looked for other paratroopers. He could see dozens of parachutes descending around him. Some landed in the forest. Others landed in the field. German machine gun fire opened up from the tree line. Klein ran toward a shell crater and dove in. 2 other paratroopers were already there. They consolidated their ammunition and equipment. The mission was to seize the high ground overlooking the Rhine and neutralize German artillery observers. Klein and his companions had no idea where they were relative to their objective. They could hear heavy fighting from multiple directions. The sound of tank guns echoed from the west, probably British armour that had crossed the Rhine. Klein's group moved toward the fighting, collecting scattered paratroopers as they went. Within an hour, Klein had joined a platoon-sized element. By afternoon, they'd seized their assigned objective, a hilltop that commanded views of the Rhine crossing sites. German artillery observers had been using this position to direct fire on the bridges. Now that fire would stop. The airborne drops weren't uniformly successful. Some units landed directly on German positions and were engaged before they could organise. The 17th Airborne Division lost over 1,500 men, killed, wounded, or missing a casualty rate approaching 20%. British 6th Airborne Division lost similar numbers, but the airborne forces achieved their primary objective. They seized the high ground east of the Rhine, capturing or killing German artillery observers who'd been directing fire on crossing sites. With the observers eliminated, German artillery fire became uncoordinated and far less effective. The airborne divisions also created chaos in the German rear areas, disrupting communications and preventing organised counterattacks. By late afternoon on March 24th, airborne and ground forces linked up. The bridgeheads were secure and expanding. By nightfall on March 24th, 24 hours after the first artillery rounds fired, 21st Army Group had over 20,000 troops across the Rhine. 14 bridges were operational, carrying a continuous stream of vehicles and supplies. The bridgeheads had merged into a continuous lodgement 15 kilometres wide and 5 to 8 kilometres deep. German resistance was collapsing. Wehrmacht units were surrendering in groups or simply retreating eastward, abandoning their positions. Montgomery's methodical approach had worked exactly as planned. The overwhelming artillery bombardment had suppressed German defences. The simultaneous crossings at multiple points prevented Germans from concentrating their forces. The airborne operation eliminated German observation posts. Everything had functioned as the plan specified. But the cost had been significant. British and Canadian forces suffered over 3,500 casualties in the first 24 hours. American airborne forces added another 1,500. Over 5,000 Allied soldiers killed or wounded to establish Rhine bridgeheads in the northern sector. Montgomery visited the bridgehead on March 25th. He was driven across a Bailey bridge in his staff car, proceeding to forward headquarters where division commanders briefed him on the operation's progress. Montgomery expressed satisfaction with the results. Casualties were within projected parameters, the bridgehead was secure, German counterattack attempts had been repulsed. Everything suggested that Plunder had succeeded as a textbook example of how to conduct a major river crossing. But Montgomery also knew that his methodical approach had been upstaged by Patton's crossing at Oppenheim 48 hours earlier. The American press was already making unfavourable comparisons. Patton crossed with one division and minimal casualties. Montgomery required 1 million men and suffered thousands of casualties. The comparison was unfair. Militarily speaking, Patton had crossed against weak opposition at a lightly defended sector. Montgomery crossed against prepared defences held by better German units. But fair or not, the comparison stung. Montgomery had won his battle and achieved his objectives. But Patton had won the headlines and the glory. The debate over methods would continue for decades. Montgomery's defenders argued that his approach saved lives in the long run by ensuring success and preventing the catastrophic failures that resulted from inadequate preparation. Patton's admirers countered that speed and audacity achieved the same results, with fewer resources and casualties. Both arguments had merit. What couldn't be argued was that by March 25th, Allied forces held multiple secure bridgeheads across the Rhine. The river barrier had been broken in the north at Wesel, in the centre at Remagen, and in the south at Oppenheim. German defences were collapsing. The road into Germany's heartland lay open. Operation Plunder had been Montgomery's masterpiece of planning and execution. Whether it was necessary to plan so thoroughly, whether a simpler approach might have sufficed, remain questions without definitive answers. The certainty was that British and Canadian soldiers had crossed the Rhine, fought through German resistance, and established themselves firmly on German soil. The war's end was now measurable in weeks, not months. March 24th, 1945, 4 a.m. A medical clearing station 1 kilometre west of the Rhine near Wesel. Captain Elizabeth Morrison, British Army Nursing Service, works in a tent that's supposed to hold 20 casualties. 50 wounded men are currently receiving treatment, more arriving every few minutes. The casualties from the Rhine crossings started arriving at midnight and haven't stopped. Morrison moves from litter to litter, performing triage with exhausted efficiency. This man has a sucking chest wound, immediate surgery required. This one has shrapnel in his legs, stable, can wait. This one is unconscious with head trauma, critical, but probably beyond help with available resources. She makes the terrible calculations that combat medics must make. Who can be saved? Who must wait? Who will die regardless of treatment? A young private, barely 18, grabs her arm. He's been gut shot, intestines visible through his torn uniform. Am I going to die, ma'am? Morrison looks at his ashen face, his dilated pupils. She knows the answer but can't say it. You're going to be fine. She lies. The doctor will see you soon. The private dies 15 minutes later, still waiting for treatment that wouldn't have saved him anyway. The casualty statistics from Rhine crossing operations were grimly precise. Allied forces suffered approximately 15 to 20,000, killed and wounded across all crossing operations from early March through early April 1945. Remagen Bridgehead cost 5,000 casualties. Oppenheim cost relatively few, perhaps 300. Plunder cost 3,500 in the first 24 hours alone, with additional thousands as the operation continued. Other smaller crossings at Mainz, Worms, and Boppard added more casualties to the total. These weren't just numbers in after-action reports. Each statistic represented a soldier who crossed the Rhine and didn't come back, or came back shattered. The casualties included infantry shot while crossing in boats, engineers blown apart by artillery while building bridges, paratroopers killed before their chutes fully deployed, tankers burned alive in armoured vehicles hit by Panzerfausts. The Rhine took its toll in every possible way combat can kill or maim soldiers. The assault boat casualties were particularly horrific. Soldiers in boats couldn't take cover, couldn't return fire effectively, couldn't do anything except row and pray. When German artillery or machine guns targeted boat formations, the results were devastating. Second Lieutenant Marcus Webb led a platoon across the Rhine at Ries during Plunder. His assault boat took a near miss from an artillery shell 50 metres from the eastern shore. The explosion capsized the boat, dumping all 12 occupants into the Rhine. Webb was wearing full combat equipment, rifle, ammunition, grenades, rations, approximately 70 pounds of gear. The weight pulled him under immediately. He clawed at his equipment straps, trying to release them, but his fingers were numb from cold water and wouldn't work properly. He inhaled water, choking. His vision started to dim. Then hands grabbed him, pulled him upward. One of his soldiers, a stronger swimmer who'd managed to ditch his equipment, dragged Webb to the surface. They reached the overturned boat and clung to it. 6 of the 12 men in the boat drowned. The rest, including Webb, reached shore and continued fighting. Webb's company suffered 40% casualties during the crossing. He was one of the lucky ones he survived. German casualties were harder to quantify, but certainly higher than Allied losses. Estimates suggested over 60,000 German soldiers were killed defending the Rhine crossings. Another 250,000 were captured in the battles following the crossings as Allied forces broke out of their bridgeheads and encircled German units. The killed included Wehrmacht regulars, SS troops still fanatically committed to Nazi ideology, and Volkssturm conscripts, old men and teenagers who died defending positions they had no chance of holding. Feldwebel Klaus Fischer, the machine gunner at Remagen mentioned earlier, survived the battle but was captured. In a prisoner interview, he described watching American forces cross the Ludendorff Bridge while his machine gun ammunition ran out. "We fired until we had nothing left to fire," Fischer said. "Then we waited for them to come kill us. But they just took us prisoner. We'd been told Americans executed prisoners, but they gave us food and cigarettes instead. The whole war was lies." The Volkssturm casualties represented particular tragedy. These were men who should never have been in combat, grandfathers who remembered the First World War, boys who should have been in school. Nazi officials had conscripted them in desperate final measures to defend German territory. They were given minimal training, obsolete weapons, and orders to hold positions against Allied forces equipped with tanks, artillery, and air support. The results were predictable. Volkssturm units defending Rhine positions were slaughtered or surrendered en masse. Heinrich Müller was 16 years old when he was conscripted into Volkssturm in February 1945. His unit was positioned to defend a riverside village near Wesel. Müller's weapon was a Panzerfaust, a single-shot anti-tank rocket launcher. He'd fired it once during training. When British tanks crossed at Wesel and approached his village, Müller's Volkssturm company was ordered to stop them. "We had 15 men with Panzerfausts and rifles against dozens of tanks," Müller recalled decades later. "Our commander was a World War I veteran with one arm. We were defending Germany," they said. "We were supposed to be heroes. We were boys sent to die for nothing." The psychological casualties were harder to count, but perhaps more numerous than physical wounds. Combat stress, shell shock, battle fatigue, the condition had many names but one reality. Soldiers exposed to intense combat, especially the grinding artillery bombardments characteristic of Rhine crossing operations, broke psychologically. Some became catatonic, unable to speak or move. Others developed uncontrollable tremors. Some simply walked away from their units, not deserting intentionally, but wandering in shock-induced confusion. Medical officers struggled to treat psychological casualties with limited understanding and fewer resources. Some soldiers were sent back to combat after brief rest periods, only to break down again more severely. Private Daniel Foster, a British infantryman who crossed at Wesel, developed severe anxiety symptoms after his best friend was killed by a mortar around 20 metres away. Foster couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, jumped violently at any sudden noise. His company commander sent him to a medical clearing station. The doctor examined him for 5 minutes and declared him fit for duty. Foster returned to his unit and fought through the rest of the war, but he was never the same. 50 years later, he still couldn't attend fireworks displays. The sounds triggered flashbacks to the Rhine crossing. The engineer casualties deserve particular recognition for their courage under impossible circumstances. Combat engineers building bridges worked completely exposed to German observation and artillery fire. They couldn't take cover while lifting steel bridge components that weighed hundreds of pounds. They couldn't work quickly enough to avoid attracting attention. They simply had to build bridges while German gunners tried to kill them. Engineer casualty rates during Rhine bridge construction reached 40% in some units. Sergeant Robert Patterson of the British Royal Engineers worked on Bailey Bridge construction at Rhys. His team was erecting the bridge's third section when German artillery found their range. The first shell killed 3 engineers instantly. Patterson and the survivors kept working. Stopping meant the bridge wouldn't be completed, and the bridge was essential to get armour across. The shells kept falling. Patterson watched men he'd known for years die around him. He kept working. The bridge was completed in 18 hours. Patterson was one of 7 survivors from a 20-man engineer platoon. He received no medal, no recognition beyond a line in an after-action report, noting that engineer casualties were higher than anticipated but acceptable given mission success. The civilian casualties added another dimension of tragedy. German civilians in Rhine front towns found themselves trapped between armies. Allied artillery bombardments killed civilians hiding in cellars. Allied airstrikes destroyed buildings with civilians inside. Some civilians were killed by German troops who executed anyone suspected of defeatism or preparing to surrender. The Nazi Nero decree, ordering destruction of German infrastructure, threatened civilians with starvation and exposure. Wehrmacht units commandeered civilian food stocks. Retreating German soldiers sometimes forced civilians to evacuate with them, using them as human shields or labour. Civilians who stayed and tried to surrender to advancing Allied forces risked being shot by German military police for treason. Anna Schneider was 19 years old, living in Wesel when the Rhine crossings began. Her family hid in their cellar during the artillery bombardment. The house collapsed on top of us, she remembered. We were buried alive. My father and brother died in the cellar. My mother and I were pulled out by British soldiers 3 days later. Everything we owned was destroyed. The British gave us food and put us in a refugee camp. We were alive, but we'd lost everything. The scale of destruction in Rhine front towns was almost incomprehensible. Wesel was 97% destroyed, essentially erased by Allied bombing and artillery. Remagen was heavily damaged. Oppenheim suffered less but still saw systematic destruction of any buildings that might offer defensive positions. The Germans added to the destruction through their scorched earth policies, demolishing bridges, flooding areas, destroying infrastructure. Civilians who survived the fighting emerged to find their homes gone, their possessions destroyed, their communities obliterated. The refugee crisis was massive. Over 100,000 German civilians were displaced by Rhine crossing operations, fleeing east to escape the fighting or being forcibly evacuated by Nazi authorities. Refugee columns clogged roads, interfering with military movements. Allied forces established civilian collection points and refugee camps, trying to care for displaced civilians while simultaneously conducting combat operations. The human cost of the Rhine crossings couldn't be reduced to casualty statistics, though the statistics were grim enough. The cost included soldiers who survived physically but carried psychological scars for decades. It included German defenders who died following orders in a lost cause. It included civilians who lost homes, families, futures. It included children orphaned, women, widowed, parents who buried sons. Every strategic objective achieved, every bridgehead established, every bridge built, came at a price paid in human suffering. Military histories often focus on tactics, logistics, command decisions. But the Rhine crossings were ultimately about human beings, soldiers who crossed rivers while being shot at, engineers who built bridges under fire, medics who treated wounds they couldn't heal, civilians who endured artillery bombardments in cellars and emerged to find their worlds destroyed. The strategic success of the Rhine crossings was real and important. The war ended more quickly because Allied forces crossed the Rhine and advanced into Germany. But the cost, measured in human terms rather than strategic abstractions, was terrible and permanent for those who paid it. March 25th, 1945, dawn. The Rhine River bank near Wesel. Captain Thomas Randolph of the British Royal Engineers surveys the progress on bridge construction. Site 7. 48 hours ago, this was an empty riverbank under German artillery fire. Now it's a hive of organised chaos. 300 engineers are working in shifts, assembling a treadway bridge, a floating pontoon bridge capable of supporting 40-ton vehicles. The work never stops. When one shift exhausts itself after 6 hours of brutal physical labour, another shift takes over. Pontoon sections are floated into position, lashed together with steel cables, anchored against the Rhine's strong current. Timber decking is laid across the pontoons, creating a roadway. Randolph watches a Sherman tank roll onto the completed portion of the bridge. The pontoons sink lower in the water under the tank's weight, but hold. The tank continues across, reaches the eastern shore, and disappears inland. Behind it, a column of trucks waits to cross. This is what the fighting was for, Randolph thinks. Not the glory of assault crossings or the drama of paratrooper drops. This unglamorous work of building bridges so armies can advance. Within a week, there will be 60 bridges across the Rhine. Without them, the war continues. With them, Germany falls. The engineering achievement of bridging the Rhine represented one of the Second World War's great logistical accomplishments. By April 30th, 1945, Allied engineers had constructed 62 major bridges across the Rhine at various points between the Netherlands and Switzerland. These bridges carried millions of tons of supplies, hundreds of thousands of vehicles, and entire armies into Germany. The bridges came in multiple types, each designed for specific purposes and conditions. Treadway bridges, assembled from floating pontoon sections, could be built quickly but had limited load capacity, typically 40 tons, enough for medium tanks and most trucks. Bailey bridges, assembled from prefabricated steel truss sections, could handle heavier loads up to 100 tons when triple stacked, but took longer to build and required more materials. Fixed pontoon bridges combined features of both types. The engineers selected bridge types based on local conditions: river width, current speed, expected traffic loads, and German artillery threat. The speed of bridge construction was remarkable considering combat conditions. The first treadway bridge at Wesel was operational 30 hours after the first infantry crossed. Bailey bridges at Ries and Xanten were completed within 48 hours of the initial assault. The construction speed reflected months of training and the accumulation of massive material stockpiles. Engineer units had practiced bridge construction until the procedures were automatic. Soldiers knew exactly which component went where, how to attach pontoons, how to lay decking, how to anchor bridges against current. The practice paid off under combat conditions. Even with German artillery firing at construction sites, even with engineers working in darkness or bad weather, even with casualty rates that would paralyze less prepared units, the bridges rose on schedule. The logistics of bridge construction were staggering. A standard Bailey bridge, 200 metres long, required approximately 300 steel panels, each weighing over 500 pounds. The panels had to be transported from warehouses to construction sites, unloaded, assembled in correct sequence, and erected into truss structures. A treadway bridge of similar length required 36 pontoon sections, each weighing over a ton when loaded with buoyancy materials. The pontoons had to be inflated, positioned in the river against the current, connected with steel cables, and decked with timber or steel roadway. Everything depended on pre-positioned supplies and practice procedures. Randolph's engineer company had stockpiled bridge materials for weeks before plunder began. When the crossing order came, they loaded trucks with precisely calculated quantities of components and drove to their assigned construction site. Within hours of the infantry establishing a bridgehead, engineers were building bridges. The German artillery response to bridge construction was intense and sustained. Wehrmacht gunners understood that destroying Allied bridges would isolate bridgehead forces and potentially enable counterattacks that could push Allied troops back across the Rhine. German artillery targeted bridge construction sites with systematic fire, often concentrating multiple batteries on single bridges. The engineers worked under continuous bombardment. Shells fell into the river, creating waterspouts that swamped pontoon sections. Shells hit riverbanks near construction sites, wounding or killing engineers. Direct hits on bridge sections destroyed hours of work in seconds. The engineers developed techniques to minimize vulnerability. They worked at night when German observation was degraded. They built multiple bridges simultaneously, forcing German artillery to divide its fire. They positioned anti-aircraft guns as artillery suppression, firing on German gun flashes. But nothing eliminated the danger completely. Engineers building bridges simply accepted that casualties were part of the mission. Corporal James Sullivan of the United States Army Engineers worked on bridge construction at Oppenheim, supporting Patton's Crossing. His company began building a treadway bridge at dawn on March 24th. German artillery found their position within 30 minutes. The first shell landed 50 metres downstream, Sullivan recalled. We kept working. Then the next shell was closer, maybe 20 metres. They were walking their fire toward us, adjusting after each shot. We knew we should take cover, but if we stopped working, the bridge wouldn't get built. So we kept going. The 4th German shell scored a direct hit on a pontoon section Sullivan's squad was positioning. 3 engineers were killed instantly. Sullivan was knocked into the Rhine by the blast, surfacing 20 meters downstream, disoriented and bleeding from shrapnel wounds. Other engineers pulled him out. The bridge construction continued. Sullivan was patched up and returned to work 4 hours later. His company completed the bridge in 36 hours, despite losing 12 engineers killed and 23 wounded during construction. The longest military bridge built during Rhine crossing operations was a Bailey Bridge at Ries, spanning 1,260 feet over a quarter mile. The bridge required over 500 Bailey panels, assembled into a triple-stack configuration capable of carrying tanks weighing 70 tons. Construction took 4 days, working around the clock. British engineers from 3 different companies worked simultaneously on different bridge sections, then connected them mid-river. The complexity was enormous. Each panel had to align precisely with adjacent panels. The truss configuration had to distribute load evenly across all supports. The entire structure had to withstand the Rhine's current without twisting or collapsing. Captain Michael Bradford supervised construction as senior engineer on site. "We were essentially building a skyscraper on its side over a river while people shot at us," Bradford said. The calculations had to be perfect. 1 misaligned panel, 1 weak connection, and the whole bridge could fail when heavy vehicles crossed. We checked everything 3 times. Then we checked again. Traffic control across Rhine bridges became critical as the number of operational bridges multiplied. Each bridge could handle finite traffic loads per day, typically 5,000 to 8,000 vehicles, depending on bridge type and capacity. Allied armies were trying to move hundreds of thousands of vehicles across the Rhine simultaneously. Traffic control officers positioned at each bridge directed vehicles to specific crossing points to prevent any single bridge from becoming overwhelmed. Priority systems determined which units crossed first. Combat units preparing for offensive operations received priority over logistics units. Armour crossed before wheeled vehicles. Ammunition and fuel trucks crossed before general supply trucks. Despite systematic control, traffic jams were common. Vehicle columns backed up for kilometres waiting to cross. German artillery occasionally targeted these traffic jams with devastating effect. A single shell landing among stalled vehicles could destroy dozens. By early April, the Rhine Bridge network was carrying 25,000 vehicles per day across multiple crossing points. The traffic flow represented the culmination of months of planning and preparation. Every vehicle crossing carried soldiers, ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, or equipment needed to sustain Allied armies advancing into Germany. The bridges transformed the Rhine from barrier to highway. Before the bridges, the river stopped Allied advance. After the bridges, it was merely another obstacle overcome, another German defensive position rendered useless. The psychological impact on German defenders was profound. Prisoners interrogated after the Rhine crossings frequently mentioned seeing Allied bridges spanning the river. "We knew we'd lost when we saw your bridges," one German officer said. "You could build bridges faster than we could destroy them. That meant you could bring over unlimited forces. We couldn't stop that." The bridge construction effort required material resources accumulated over months. Allied factories in Britain and the United States had produced Bailey Bridge components continuously since 1943. By early 1945, over 50 miles worth of Bailey panels, enough to build bridges totaling 50 miles in length, were stockpiled in forward depots in France and Belgium. Treadway pontoons numbered in the thousands, timber for bridge decking, steel cables for anchoring, bolts and connectors, and specialised tools. Everything required for bridge construction was available in quantities that ensured engineers would never lack materials. The industrial capacity supporting the bridge building was itself a decisive military advantage. Germany, with its factories bombed and its industrial production collapsing, couldn't match Allied engineering resources. German engineers destroyed bridges competently, but they had no capacity to rebuild them. Allied engineers built bridges faster than Germans could destroy them, and that capacity determined the Rhine campaign's outcome as much as any tactical brilliance or soldier courage. The bridges also enabled the evacuation of wounded and the flow of replacement troops. Ambulances crossed westbound on Rhine bridges, carrying casualties to rear area hospitals. Replacement troops crossed eastbound, joining depleted units in the bridgeheads. The two-way traffic was continuous. Medical clearing stations west of the Rhine processed thousands of casualties daily, stabilizing them for transport to hospitals in France or Britain. Replacement depots east of the Rhine processed thousands of fresh troops, assigning them to units that needed reinforcements. The bridges made this logistics flow possible. Without them, wounded would have died waiting for evacuation across a river with no crossings. Without them, depleted combat units would have fought until they were too weak to continue. The bridges were unglamorous, utilitarian structures, but they were as essential to Allied victory as any fighter aircraft or tank division. By May 8th, 1945, when Germany surrendered, the Rhine bridges had carried over 2 million soldiers, 500,000 vehicles, and uncountable tons of supplies into Germany. The bridges had enabled the final Allied offensives that ended the war. They'd supported the advances that captured the Ruhr industrial region, crossed central Germany, and linked up with Soviet forces at the Elbe and River. Without the bridges, those advances would have been impossible or fatally delayed. The Rhine bridges represented engineering triumph, human courage, industrial capacity, and systematic planning, all combined into structures of steel, timber, and pontoons spanning a river that had protected Germany for millennia. Captain Randolph, watching traffic flow across his completed bridge in late March, understood the significance, even if he couldn't articulate it poetically. The bridge worked. Vehicles crossed safely. The war continued eastward. That was enough. The bridges rose, and Germany fell. April 1st, 1945. 2 weeks after the Rhine crossings, General Dwight Eisenhower stands in his forward command post, studying a situation map of Western Europe. The map is covered with coloured pins and grease pencil marks showing Allied unit positions. 2 weeks ago, those positions were clustered along the Rhine's western bank, stopped by the river barrier. Now they're scattered across Western Germany, advancing 50 miles per day in some sectors, racing toward the Elbe River where Soviet forces are advancing from the east. Eisenhower traces the advance routes with his finger. British forces have broken out from the Wesel bridgehead and are driving toward Hamburg. American First Army has exploited the Remagen bridgehead, encircling the Ruhr industrial region, Germany's economic heart, in a massive pocket that traps over 300,000 German troops. Patton's Third Army has raced from Oppenheim through southern Germany, covering 200 miles in 2 weeks. The Rhine crossings didn't just breach a defensive line, they shattered German capability to conduct organised resistance. The Wehrmacht is disintegrating, not just retreating. Units are surrendering en masse. Others are simply dissolving, soldiers walking away from positions and heading home. The war isn't over yet, but its end is now measurable in weeks, not months. Eisenhower permits himself a brief smile. The Rhine crossings worked. Germany is falling. The speed of Allied advance after the Rhine crossings shocked even Allied commanders who'd planned the operations. Pre-crossing estimates predicted that advancing from the Rhine to the Elbe River approximately 250 miles would require 6 to 8 weeks of fighting against organised German resistance. The actual advance took 3 weeks in most sectors, some units covering the distance in less. The acceleration reflected the complete collapse of German defensive capabilities after the Rhine barrier fell. Wehrmacht units that had fought tenaciously to defend the Rhine lost cohesion once Allied forces broke through. German commanders couldn't establish new defensive lines because they lacked troops, equipment, and communications to coordinate defences. The Allies had achieved what military theorists call operational breakthrough, penetrating enemy defences so completely that the enemy loses ability to conduct organised resistance. The encirclement of the Ruhr demonstrated the strategic impact of Rhine crossings. First Army's breakout from Remagen bridgehead drove northeast, while 9th Army's advance from Wesel drove southeast. On April 1st, the two forces linked up at Lippstadt, creating a pocket that trapped German Army Group B over 325,000 troops, including 21 divisions. Field Marshal Model, commanding the encircled forces, received orders from Hitler to fight to the last man. Model ignored the orders. He knew his trapped forces couldn't break out and couldn't be relieved. Continuing to fight would only waste lives defending an already lost position. Model ordered his forces to surrender on April 18th. Over 300,000 German soldiers marched into prisoner of war camps. Model himself committed suicide rather than surrender, but his decision to order his troops to give up saved thousands of lives on both sides. The Ruhr encirclement eliminated Germany's largest remaining field force and captured the industrial region that produced 30% of Germany's coal and steel. Germany could no longer sustain military operations without the Ruhr. The war's end became inevitable. The German collapse manifested differently across various sectors. In some areas, Wehrmacht units fought rearguard actions to delay Allied advance, but didn't attempt to hold fixed positions. These units would occupy a town, resist briefly, then retreat before being encircled. In other areas, German resistance evaporated entirely. Allied spearheads entered towns expecting fights and found white flags hanging from windows, German soldiers eager to surrender. The variation reflected the breakdown of German command and control. Hitler, isolated in his Berlin bunker, issued orders that bore no relationship to military reality. He commanded non-existent divisions to counterattack. He forbade retreats that had already happened. He ordered cities defended that had already fallen. Lower-level German commanders faced impossible choices: obey insane orders and waste their soldiers' lives, or surrender and risk execution for treason. Many chose surrender. The more fanatical Nazi believers chose suicidal resistance. The result was chaotic, unpredictable German responses that sometimes surprised Allied forces with fierce resistance and other times offered no resistance at all. The race to the Elbe became the final chapter of the Rhine crossing campaign's strategic consequences. Allied forces drove east to link up with Soviet armies advancing from the opposite direction. The meeting point somewhere in central Germany would determine the post-war division of Europe. British forces pushed toward the North German ports, seeking to reach the Baltic before Soviets occupied Denmark. American forces drove toward Leipzig and the Elbe. Patton's Third Army raced southeast into Bavaria, aiming for Czechoslovakia. The advances covered vast distances at speeds unprecedented in modern warfare. Armoured columns advanced 50 to 70 miles per day when roads were open and German resistance minimal. Infantry divisions, moving in trucks rather than marching, kept pace with armour. The advance resembled the German blitzkrieg of 1940, but in reverse, Allied forces using German tactics against Germany itself. The human cost of the rapid advance was paradoxically both higher and lower than the Rhine crossings themselves. Fewer Allied soldiers died per day during the April advances compared to the March crossings. The fighting was less intense, casualties lighter, but the advances covered such vast territory and involved so many units that total casualties accumulated quickly. Over 10,000 Allied soldiers were killed or wounded in April's operations across Germany. German casualties were far higher, tens of thousands killed, hundreds of thousands captured. German civilian casualties also mounted as fighting moved into German cities and towns. Allied airstrikes, artillery bombardments, and ground combat killed German civilians caught in combat zones. The estimates of German civilian deaths in April 1945 ranged from 20 to 40,000. The rapid Allied advance compressed months of potential fighting into weeks, ending the war more quickly but creating intense violence in the areas where fighting occurred. The strategic implications of the Rhine crossings became clearer as Allied forces penetrated deeper into Germany. The crossings hadn't just created tactical bridgeheads, they destroyed Germany's last coherent defensive line and opened the entire country to Allied penetration. German commanders after the war confirmed this assessment. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Wehrmacht Operations Staff, later testified that the loss of the Rhine meant the loss of Germany. Once Allied forces crossed in strength and established permanent bridges, German defeat became mathematically certain. Germany lacked the resources to defend against attacks from both west and east simultaneously. The Wehrmacht had too few divisions, too little fuel, too little ammunition, too few aircraft. Every German division defending against Western allies was a division unavailable to stop Soviets advancing from the east. Every litre of fuel used by tanks fighting Americans was fuel unavailable for tanks fighting Russians. Germany faced strategic impossibility, and the Rhine crossings had made that impossibility manifest. The debate between Montgomery's and Patton's approaches to river crossing took on new dimensions when analysed through strategic results. Montgomery's supporters argued that his methodical plunder operation created the strongest bridgehead, enabling British forces to advance rapidly toward Hamburg and cutting off German forces in the Netherlands and Denmark. Patton's admirers countered that his opportunistic Oppenheim crossing achieved similar strategic results with fraction of the resources and casualties. Both arguments had merit, but both also missed larger strategic reality. By late March 1945, Germany was going to lose, regardless of whether Rhine crossings were conducted with Montgomery's caution or Patton's audacity. The strategic question wasn't whether to cross the Rhine, but how to cross it most efficiently. Montgomery's approach minimized risk at the cost of time and resources. Patton's approach accepted higher risk for speed and economy. Different military situations favored different approaches. The Rhine crossings demonstrated that both methods could succeed when applied appropriately. Churchill's strategic vision shaped the final phase of Rhine crossing exploitation. The Prime Minister urged Allied commanders to push as far east as possible before German surrender, maximising Western-occupied territory in post-war negotiations with Soviets. Churchill feared Soviet expansion into Central Europe and wanted Allied forces positioned to limit communist influence. Eisenhower disagreed, arguing that military forces should focus on defeating Germany rather than positioning for post-war politics. The disagreement reflected different understandings of what the Rhine crossings had achieved. Churchill saw them as opening opportunities for strategic territorial gains. Eisenhower saw them as enabling the military destruction of German armed forces. The debate was never fully resolved. Allied forces advanced as far east as operational circumstances permitted, meeting Soviets at the Elbe on April 25th. The meeting point wasn't determined by political considerations but by military logistics. Allied forces had outrun their supply lines and needed to pause for resupply. The German population's reaction to Allied breakthrough revealed the Rhine crossings' psychological impact. Before the crossings, German civilians had clung to hope that the Rhine would stop Allied advance, giving Germany time to negotiate favourable peace terms or deploy miracle weapons that Nazi propaganda promised. After the crossings, that hope evaporated. German civilians recognised that the war was lost and Allied occupation inevitable. The psychological shift manifested in increased surrenders, decreased resistance, and growing acceptance of defeat. German soldiers, who might have fought fanatically to defend the Rhine from Allied crossing, often surrendered without fight once Allied forces were across and advancing. The Rhine had been Germany's psychological fortress as much as its military barrier. Once Allied forces crossed it, German morale collapsed along with German defensive lines. By May 8th, when Germany surrendered unconditionally, Allied forces occupied all of Western Germany and had advanced well into Eastern Germany before halting at agreed demarcation lines with Soviet forces. The Rhine crossings of March 1945 had enabled this conquest in 6 weeks. Without the crossings, the war would have continued months longer, killing hundreds of thousands more soldiers and civilians. Strategic analysis conducted after the war confirmed that the Rhine crossings shortened the European war by an estimated 4 to 6 months. Those months mattered enormously. Every additional month of war meant more Holocaust victims murdered, more cities destroyed by bombing, more soldiers killed on all fronts. The Rhine crossings' strategic value couldn't be measured. Just in military terms, bridgeheads established, German divisions destroyed, territory occupied. The crossings' ultimate value was time. They ended the war faster. They saved lives by making continued resistance obviously futile. The Rhine barrier had protected Germany for millennia. In March 1945, it failed to protect Germany for even 2 weeks. That failure doomed Nazi Germany and ended World War II in Europe. December 1945. Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The United States Army Command and General Staff College. Lieutenant Colonel Harold Fisher leads a seminar analysing Rhine crossing operations for mid-level officers who will apply lessons learned to future military planning. Fisher fought at Remagen with 9th Armoured Division, then participated in the exploitation breakout. Now he's tasked with determining what worked, what failed, and why. The seminar room walls are covered with maps, casualty charts, and operational timelines. Fisher addresses his students. Gentlemen, the Rhine crossings provide case studies in every aspect of military operations, planning, logistics, tactics, leadership. We succeeded, obviously. We crossed the river, established bridgeheads, and won the war. But success doesn't mean we did everything right. Our casualties were significant. Some operations succeeded despite poor planning rather than because of good planning. Today we'll analyse the crossings objectively, identifying both successes and failures so we can improve doctrine for future operations. The first analytical question Fisher posed was whether the Rhine crossings were necessary at all. Could Allied forces have bypassed the Rhine, isolating German forces west of the river and advancing around them? Analysis revealed this option was strategically impossible. The Rhine's length over 800 miles meant that bypassing it would require advancing through Switzerland or the Netherlands' complex river systems, both operationally infeasible. Germany's geography made the Rhine unavoidable. Any advance into Germany's heartland required crossing it. The operational question wasn't whether to cross, but where and how. The Allied decision to cross at multiple points simultaneously, Remagen accidentally, Oppenheim opportunistically, Wesel deliberately proved strategically sound. Multiple crossings prevented Germans from concentrating forces against any single bridgehead. Even if one crossing failed, others would succeed. The casualty analysis produced surprising results. Comparing casualties per soldier involved in crossing operations revealed that Patton's Oppenheim crossing was most efficient, approximately 1 casualty per 91 soldiers crossed in the first 24 hours. Remagen's ratios were less favourable, approximately 1 casualty per 5 soldiers in the bridgehead during the first 10 days. Montgomery's Plunder suffered approximately 1 casualty per 6 soldiers crossed in the first day. These ratios reflected different German defensive strengths at each sector. Oppenheim faced minimal opposition Volkssturm and depleted Wehrmacht remnants. Plunder faced organised German defences with artillery support. Remagen Bridgehead faced concentrated German counterattacks designed to eliminate the unexpected penetration. The lesson wasn't that Patton's method was superior, but that crossing at lightly defended sectors produced lower casualties, regardless of method employed. The equipment effectiveness analysis challenged pre-war assumptions about river crossing capabilities. Assault boats, the standard infantry crossing tool, proved more vulnerable than expected. Casualty rates in assault boats reached 40 to 50% in heavily opposed crossings when German artillery achieved concentration on boat formations. Storm boats with motors reduced crossing time and casualties but sacrificed surprise through engine noise. Buffaloes, the armoured amphibious vehicles, proved most effective for reducing infantry casualties. Buffalo-mounted troops suffered approximately half the casualty rate of assault boat troops in comparable crossings. The analysis recommended future amphibious operations emphasize armoured crossing vehicles over unprotected boats. The cost-benefit calculation was clear. Buffaloes cost more to build and maintain than assault boats, but they saved lives in combat. Equipment cost was measurable. Human life was invaluable. The artillery support analysis revealed both successes and limitations. Montgomery's massive preparatory bombardment at Plunder suppressed German defences effectively, but it also warned Germans that crossing attempts were imminent, allowing them to move reserves forward. Patton's approach, minimal preparatory fires to maintain surprise, worked at Oppenheim because German defences were already weak. The lesson was contextual. Heavy preparatory bombardment proved valuable against strong defences, but unnecessary against weak defences. The ideal approach required accurate intelligence about enemy defensive strength, then tailoring artillery support accordingly. Blind adherence to doctrine, always conduct preparatory bombardment or never conduct preparatory bombardment, proved inferior to flexible approaches based on specific situations. The airborne operation at Varsity produced mixed analytical conclusions. Operation Varsity achieved its objectives, seizing high ground east of Rhine and neutralising German observation posts. But airborne forces suffered 20% casualties, and some analysts questioned whether the objectives could have been achieved through ground assault at lower cost. The airborne drop's primary value was timing paratroopers seized critical terrain simultaneously with river crossings rather than hours later through ground advance. That timing prevented German artillery observers from directing effective fire on crossing sites during the critical first hours. The casualties were significant, but the alternative crossing, under sustained, accurate artillery fire, without airborne support, would likely have produced even higher casualties among crossing forces. Varsity was expensive, but probably necessary given the operational requirements. The bridge construction analysis identified several critical lessons. First, pre-positioning materials near crossing sites dramatically reduced bridge construction time. Sites where materials were stockpiled had bridges operational in 24 to 48 hours. Sites where materials had to be transported, distances had bridges delayed by days. Second, bridge construction under fire required accepting high engineer casualties or providing massive fire suppression. There was no middle option. Engineers working exposed on bridges were extremely vulnerable. Either provide enough artillery and air support to suppress German fires completely, or accept that 40% engineer casualties were likely. Third, building multiple bridge types simultaneously. Treadway, Bailey, pontoon provided redundancy that proved essential when individual bridges were damaged or destroyed. German artillery destroyed or heavily damaged 11 bridges during Rhine operations. In every case, other nearby bridges maintained traffic flow, while damaged bridges were repaired or replaced. The surprise factor analysis revealed uncomfortable truths about operational security. Remagen succeeded partly through German incompetence. The bridge should have been destroyed before American forces arrived. Oppenheim succeeded through excellent operational security and German weakness. Plunder's operational security was compromised. Germans knew approximately when and where British forces would cross, but succeeded anyway through overwhelming force. The lesson was that surprise, while valuable, wasn't essential if force ratios favoured the attacker sufficiently. Montgomery's approach accepted that Germans would know his intentions and relied on superior firepower to succeed despite lack of surprise. Patton's approach prioritised surprise to reduce force requirements. Both worked under appropriate circumstances. German defender interrogations provided valuable insights into defensive failures. German soldiers consistently cited 3 factors that undermined Rhine defences. First, overwhelming Allied artillery fire suppressed defensive positions and prevented effective resistance. We couldn't fight back. Effectively, when we couldn't leave our bunkers without being killed, one German officer explained. Second, Allied air supremacy meant German movements were observed and attacked, while Allied movements went largely unopposed. You could move troops in daylight. We could only move at night. And even then, your aircraft found us, another prisoner noted. Third, German logistics collapse, fuel shortages, ammunition rationing, food scarcity meant defenders lacked resources to conduct effective defence, even when motivated to fight. The Rhine defences were theoretically formidable but practically degraded by Germany's collapsing war economy. The doctrine revision recommendations emerging from Rhine crossing analysis fundamentally changed American and British river crossing doctrine for the next several decades. The revised doctrine emphasised flexibility over rigid procedures. It recommended tailoring crossing operations to specific conditions rather than applying standard templates. It elevated engineer forces to equal importance with infantry and armour in river crossing operations. Previous doctrine treated engineers as support troops, but Rhine operations proved engineer capabilities were as essential as combat capabilities. The doctrine increased emphasis on armoured crossing vehicles and de-emphasised unprotected assault boats. It recommended decentralised execution, giving subordinate commanders authority to adapt plans based on local conditions, rather than requiring adherence to centralised plans regardless of circumstances. The cost-benefit analysis of different crossing approaches produced the seminar's most heated debates. Montgomery supporters argued that his approach saved lives in the long term by ensuring success and preventing costly failures. They calculated that if Plunder had failed and required repeating, total casualties would have far exceeded the 3,500 actually suffered. Patton's supporters countered that Oppenheim proved methodical preparation was often unnecessary, and that accepting moderate risks to achieve surprise and economy was strategically preferable to expending massive resources on overwhelming force. Fisher mediated the debate by noting that military situations vary. Sometimes Montgomery's approach is optimal, sometimes Patton's approach is optimal. The key is recognizing which situation you're facing and adapting accordingly. Rigid adherence to either approach is doctrinaire and dangerous. The final analytical question was whether Rhine crossing operations could have been conducted differently to achieve better results. Could crossings have occurred earlier? Analysis suggested no earlier crossings would have faced stronger German defences before Allied superiority in artillery, air power, and logistics became overwhelming. Could crossings have occurred with fewer casualties? Possibly, if all crossings had been concentrated at lightly defended sectors like Oppenheim, but intelligence wasn't perfect, and Germans could reinforce lightly defended sectors if given time. The analytical consensus was that Rhine crossings were conducted reasonably well given the information and resources available. Mistakes were made. Some units crossed at unnecessarily heavily defended points. Some artillery preparations were excessive while others were insufficient. Some bridge construction efforts suffered preventable delays. But overall, the operations succeeded at acceptable cost. The Rhine was crossed. Germany was defeated. The lessons learned would shape military doctrine for generations. Fisher concluded his seminar. Gentlemen, we won. We learned from our victories as much as our defeats. Study these operations carefully. Your lives and your soldiers' lives may someday depend on applying these lessons correctly. January 1952. Oxford University, England. Professor Michael Howard delivers a lecture on alternate history scenarios of the Rhine crossings. His audience includes military historians, veterans, and students interested in how small changes in circumstances could have produced dramatically different outcomes. Howard begins provocatively. The Rhine crossings succeeded. Germany was defeated. The war ended in May 1945. We remember these as historical facts. But history is contingent, not inevitable. Let us consider what might have happened if key circumstances had been different. What if the Remagen Bridge had been destroyed as planned? What if weather had delayed Operation Plunder? What if German reserves had been positioned differently? These counterfactuals illuminate how close the historical outcome was to quite different possibilities. The Remagen counterfactual was most obvious. If German demolitions had functioned properly and the Ludendorff Bridge collapsed before American forces could cross, the entire Rhine crossing campaign would have developed differently. Without Remagen's accidental, bridgehead American forces in that sector would have needed to conduct deliberate assault crossings, similar to Plunder or Oppenheim. The First Army crossing would have been delayed by at least 2 weeks, while engineers accumulated assault boats and constructed crossing plans. More significantly, those 98,000 German troops who were tied down containing the Remagen bridgehead would have been available as reserves to oppose other Allied crossings. Model could have used those divisions to reinforce the Wesel sector against Plunder or the Oppenheim sector against Patton. Either way, Allied casualties would have been higher, possibly significantly higher. Professor Howard calculated that losing Remagen might have added 5,000 to 10,000 Allied casualties across all Rhine crossing operations and extended the war by 4 to 6 weeks. The weather counterfactual examined how meteorological conditions affected operations. Operation Plunder was scheduled for March 23rd, but had already been postponed twice due to bad weather, once on March 19th, once on March 21st. If weather had remained unsuitable, Plunder might have been delayed into April. That delay would have had cascading effects. Patton crossed at Oppenheim on March 22nd, 1 day before Plunder. If Plunder had been delayed 2 more weeks, Patton would have had a 2-week head start establishing his bridgehead and beginning exploitation. The psychological impact on Montgomery being upstaged by Patton by 2 weeks rather than 1 day might have been profound. More significantly, delaying all Rhine crossings into April would have extended the war into May or June. Additional weeks of war meant additional casualties, additional Holocaust victims, additional destruction. Weather was uncontrollable, but its impact on operations was enormous. The German reserve positioning counterfactual explored how different German strategic decisions might have affected crossing operations. Model's Army Group B was defending a 300-kilometre front with approximately 55 divisions. He positioned those divisions based on intelligence estimates of where Allied crossings would occur. But if German intelligence had been better, if they'd seen through Allied deceptions, if they'd correctly predicted Oppenheim and Remagen crossing sites, Model could have concentrated forces differently. Professor Howard calculated that if Model had positioned 3 additional panzer divisions at Oppenheim, Patton's crossing would likely have failed with heavy casualties. If Model had positioned even 1 additional division at Remagen with orders to destroy the bridge at first sign of American approach, the bridge would never have been captured. German defensive decisions were based on limited intelligence and incorrect assumptions. Better German intelligence could have dramatically changed outcomes. The Allied command decision counterfactual examined what might have happened if Eisenhower had rejected Montgomery's plunder plan and instead concentrated all Allied forces for a single massive crossing at one point. Some American officers had advocated this approach: cross the Rhine with overwhelming force at a single sector, establish an enormous bridgehead, then exploit with all available armour and mechanized infantry simultaneously. The advantage would have been concentration of force. The disadvantage would have been predictability. Germans would know where the crossing would occur and could concentrate their defences accordingly. Professor Howard's analysis suggested a single-point crossing strategy would have produced higher casualties, but possibly faster breakthrough. The debate paralleled broader strategic arguments between concentration and dispersal of forces. Military theory offered no definitive answer. Context mattered more than abstract principles. The technological counterfactual imagined how different technologies might have changed operations. What if Allied forces had possessed more buffaloes, say 5,000 instead of 900? Infantry casualties during crossings would have been dramatically lower, perhaps 50% fewer than historically recorded. What if Allied forces had possessed jet aircraft in large numbers, providing even more complete air superiority? German movements would have been further restricted, defensive capabilities further degraded. What if Germans had possessed more effective anti-aircraft weapons or jet fighters that contested Allied air superiority? Allied crossing preparations might have been disrupted, casualties higher, operations delayed. Technology shaped tactical options and operational outcomes. Different technological balances would have produced different historical results. The political counterfactual explored how different Allied strategic priorities might have shaped Rhine crossing operations. Churchill wanted Allied forces to advance as far east as possible before German surrender, maximising Western-occupied territory in post-war negotiations with Soviets. Eisenhower prioritised destroying German military forces over territorial occupation. If Churchill's political objectives had prevailed over Eisenhower's military objectives, Allied crossings might have been rushed to occur earlier, accepting higher casualties to gain time for deeper penetration into Germany. Alternatively, if Roosevelt had lived longer, he died on April 12, 1945. His negotiating relationship with Stalin might have produced different agreements about occupation zones, potentially changing operational priorities. Politics and military strategy were always intertwined. Different political circumstances would have generated different strategic imperatives. The catastrophic failure counterfactual imagined worst-case scenarios. What if one major crossing, say, Plunder, had failed catastrophically? What if German defences had been stronger? Allied artillery preparation insufficient. Assault waves shattered by defensive fires. Bridgeheads eliminated by counterattacks. The psychological impact would have been devastating. Allied public opinion, war-weary after 5 years of combat, might have demanded reassessment of strategy. Political pressure might have forced negotiated settlement rather than unconditional surrender demands. Germany, encouraged by successful Rhine defence, might have fought on longer. Professor Howard noted this counterfactual was unlikely given Allied material superiority, but not impossible. Military operations involve enough chaos and friction that catastrophic failures can occur even when force ratios favour success. The historical Rhine crossings succeeded, but success wasn't foreordained. The extended war counterfactual examined consequences if Rhine crossings had been delayed or prevented through German defensive success. If the war had extended into summer 1945, several significant factors would have changed. First, Soviet forces advancing from the east would have occupied more German territory, potentially extending Soviet control into areas historically occupied by Western allies. Second, additional months of war meant additional Holocaust victims. The concentration camps were still operating in April 1945, murdering thousands daily. Third, longer war meant more German cities destroyed by Allied bombing. Fourth, American deployment of atomic weapons might have been directed against Germany rather than Japan. Truman was prepared to use atomic bombs on Germany if war continued past atomic weapon availability in July-August 1945. An extended European war could have seen Hiroshima-scale devastation visited on Berlin or Hamburg instead. The Soviet alternative counterfactual imagined what Rhine crossings might have looked like if conducted by Soviet forces using Red Army doctrine rather than Western Allied doctrine. Soviet river crossing tactics emphasized speed over preparation, accepted high casualties as necessary, cost of rapid advance, and relied on human wave attacks to overwhelm defensive positions. Professor Howard speculated that Soviet-style Rhine crossings would have occurred earlier. Soviets wouldn't have spent months accumulating supplies like Montgomery, but would have cost far more casualties, possibly 50 to 100,000 killed and wounded rather than the 15 to 20,000 actually suffered. The counterfactual highlighted how different military cultures approached the same problem differently. Neither approach was objectively superior. Each reflected different values about acceptable casualties, preparation time, and operational risk. The final counterfactual Professor Howard presented was the most speculative. What if Germany had successfully developed and deployed advanced weapons jet aircraft in large numbers? V-weapons, with greater accuracy and destructive power, or even atomic weapons before Rhine crossings occurred? Advanced German technology might have contested Allied air superiority, disrupted logistics build-ups, or even made certain crossing operations prohibitively costly. But Howard noted this counterfactual required earlier German technological development than was historically possible. Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing by early 1945. Even with earlier weapons development, production and deployment at scale would have been impossible given Allied bombing and resource shortages. The counterfactual was interesting theoretically but implausible practically. Howard concluded his lecture by emphasizing that counterfactual analysis served specific purposes. It wasn't idle speculation, but rather a tool for understanding causation and contingency in history. By examining what might have happened under different circumstances, historians could better understand why what actually happened occurred as it did. The Rhine crossings succeeded for identifiable reasons: Allied material superiority, German defensive weakness, competent planning and execution, and fortunate circumstances at Remagen. But success wasn't inevitable. Different circumstances could have produced different outcomes, some more favourable to Allies, some more favourable to Germans. Understanding the range of possibilities enriched understanding of historical reality. The Rhine was crossed in March 1945, Germany was defeated in May 1945, and the war ended. But it might have happened differently. That knowledge that history is contingent rather than predetermined was the most important lesson counterfactual analysis could teach. June 1950, Rhine River, Korea. Captain Robert Chen, United States Army Corps of Engineers, watches his company prepare for a river crossing operation against North Korean forces positioned on the opposite shore. The Han is narrower than the Rhine, only 200 metres at this point, but the tactical problem is identical. Enemy forces hold the far bank. Allied troops need to cross under fire, establish a bridgehead, and build permanent bridges to sustain offensive operations. Chen pulls a worn field manual from his pack, River Crossing Operations, published by the Army in 1946. The doctrine is based entirely on Rhine crossing. Lessons learned. Chen has studied Remagen, Oppenheim, and Plunder in detail at the engineer school. Now he's applying those lessons in a different war, different river, different enemy. But the fundamentals remain constant. Chen briefs his platoon leaders using procedures developed on the Rhine 5 years earlier. First wave crosses in assault boats at 0300. Artillery preparation begins at 0230. Engineers begin bridge construction the moment infantry secures the far shore. We've done this before, gentlemen. Not us personally, but our army. The Rhine crossings taught us how to do this right. We follow the doctrine, we adapt to local conditions, and we get our troops across alive. The Rhine crossings' doctrinal legacy shaped American and British military river crossing operations for the next 80 years. The comprehensive after-action reports produced in late 1945 became foundational texts at military schools worldwide. The United States Army Command and General Staff College incorporated Rhine crossing case studies into its curriculum immediately after the war. British Staff College did likewise. Soviet military theorists studied translated American and British reports, incorporating lessons into Red Army doctrine. The Rhine crossings represented the largest opposed river crossings in modern warfare, conducted by professional militaries using industrial-age equipment and methods. Every subsequent military that needed to cross contested rivers studied the Rhine operations. The equipment legacy was equally significant. The Buffalo amphibious vehicle, proven effective at the Rhine, remained in service through the Korean War and was continuously upgraded through the Vietnam War era. Modern amphibious assault vehicles used by the United States Marine Corps trace direct lineage to Rhine-era Buffaloes. Bailey bridges, tested comprehensively during Rhine operations, became the standard military bridge system for NATO forces throughout the Cold War. Improved Bailey Bridge variants are still in service with multiple militaries today, over 80 years after the original design. The assault boat designs used at the Rhine influenced military small boat development for decades. Modern military doctrine still emphasizes the same principles. Rhine crossings demonstrated combined arms coordination, overwhelming fire support, rapid exploitation, and redundant bridging capabilities. The Korean War's Han River crossing in 1950 applied Rhine lessons directly. American and South Korean forces crossed the Han using tactics and equipment nearly identical to those used at the Rhine. Assault boats carried first-wave infantry. Artillery provided preparatory bombardment. Combat engineers built Bailey bridges within hours of infantry securing the far shore. The Han crossing succeeded with relatively low casualties, fewer than 200 Allied killed and wounded, partly because North Korean defences were weaker than Wehrmacht Rhine defences had been, but also because Allied forces applied proven Rhine crossing doctrine effectively. Officers who'd fought at the Rhine-commanded units in Korea. The institutional knowledge transferred directly from one war to the next. The Cold War's strategic landscape made the Rhine itself a potential battlefield again. NATO defensive planning assumed that any Warsaw Pact invasion of Western Europe would cross the Rhine from east to west, the reverse direction of the 1945 crossings. NATO engineers surveyed Rhine crossing sites, prepared demolition plans for bridges, and stockpiled equipment for defensive riverline operations. The irony wasn't lost on military planners. The river that Allied forces had fought so hard to cross in 1945 became the defensive barrier Western forces would fight to hold in any future European war. The Rhine crossing lessons applied equally to defensive operations. The same factors that made the Rhine difficult to cross in attack width, current, observation advantages for defenders made it valuable for defense. The Vietnam War saw Rhine crossing doctrine adapted to different riverine environments. The Mekong Delta's countless waterways required different techniques than European rivers, but fundamental principles remained constant. American forces crossing rivers under fire in Vietnam used modified assault boats similar to Rhine-era designs. Combat engineers built floating bridges using principles developed from Rhine operations. The differences were in details and local adaptations, not core concepts. A 1965 river crossing in Vietnam followed essentially the same sequence as a 1945 Rhine crossing. Suppression fires, assault boat crossing, bridgehead establishment, permanent bridge construction, exploitation. The 50 years separating the operations hadn't changed fundamental military realities. The Iraq War in 2003 demonstrated Rhine legacy's continued relevance. American forces crossed the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, using doctrine descended directly from Rhine crossing operations. Modern technology changed tactical details, satellite reconnaissance instead of aerial photography, precision-guided munitions instead of massed artillery, armoured vehicles far more capable than World War II Buffaloes. But operational sequencing remained similar. Engineers still built floating bridges, infantry still crossed in vulnerable boats or amphibious vehicles, artillery still provided suppression fires. The 2003 crossings were faster, more precise, and less costly in casualties than Rhine crossings, but they followed the same conceptual framework. Rhine crossing doctrine, updated and modernized, remained relevant 6 decades after its development. The Ukrainian conflict, beginning in 2014, brought Rhine crossing lessons full circle. Ukrainian and Russian forces both attempted river crossings under fire, facing the same fundamental challenges Wehrmacht and Allied forces faced in 1945. The Russian attempt to cross the Seversky Donets River in May 2022 failed catastrophically, losing an entire battalion task group when Ukrainian artillery destroyed bridges and trapped Russian forces on the wrong side of the river. Military analysts worldwide immediately compared the failure to Rhine crossing lessons. The Russians had violated fundamental principles. They attempted crossing without adequate suppression of enemy artillery. They failed to establish sufficient bridgehead before committing heavy forces. They didn't build redundant bridges to maintain crossing capability if primary bridges were destroyed. Rhine crossing doctrine, properly applied, might have prevented the disaster. The fact that military forces 80 years after the Rhine still struggled with river crossing operations demonstrated both the operation's fundamental difficulty and the enduring relevance of lessons learned in 1945. The academic legacy shaped how military history was taught at universities and war colleges. The Rhine crossings became standard case studies for examining, planning and logistics, combined arms operations, civil-military relations and strategic decision-making. Hundreds of books, thousands of articles and countless dissertations analysed Rhine operations from every conceivable angle. The operations were dissected for lessons about leadership, what made some commanders effective and others less so. They were analysed for organisational insights. How did armies coordinate complex operations involving millions of soldiers? They were examined for technological implications. How did equipment capabilities shape tactical options? The Rhine crossings became a lens through which multiple generations of military professionals understood modern warfare. The memorial and commemoration legacy ensured Rhine crossing participants weren't forgotten. The Remagen Bridge Museum, established in the surviving bridge towers, welcomed over 500,000 visitors annually. The museum displayed photographs, artifacts, and personal accounts from the March 7th bridge capture. Veterans reunions brought American and German soldiers together at Remagen every 5 years through the 21st century. Former enemies meeting as old men to remember shared experiences. Similar commemorations occurred at Wesel, Oppenheim, and other crossing sites. British and Canadian veterans held annual reunions to honour those killed during plunder. The commemorations served multiple purposes: honouring sacrifice, educating younger generations, and maintaining institutional memory of what river crossing operations actually cost in human terms. The engineering profession's legacy drew inspiration from Rhine bridge builders. Civil engineers studied Bailey bridge designs for decades, adapting military bridging technology for civilian disaster relief and infrastructure projects. When earthquakes, floods, or other disasters destroyed civilian bridges, emergency response teams often deployed Bailey-type bridges as temporary replacements. The technology developed for warfare found peaceful applications. Engineer professional organizations honored Rhine crossing engineers through awards and recognition programs. The American Society of Civil Engineers established the Rhine Crossing Medal in 1948, awarded to combat engineers who distinguished themselves during river crossing operations. The medal recognized that engineering courage under fire deserved equal recognition to infantry valor. The doctrinal debates about preparation versus speed, Montgomery versus Patton, never fully resolved but became permanent features of military education. War colleges used Rhine crossing case studies to teach students that military problems rarely had single correct answers. Montgomery's approach worked at Wesel, Patton's approach worked at Oppenheim. Both were correct within their contexts. The lesson was flexibility and adaptation rather than doctrinaire adherence to one method. Modern military doctrine emphasized mission command, giving subordinate commanders clear objectives but allowing them flexibility in execution methods. Rhine crossings provided historical examples that reinforced this philosophy. Different commanders with different styles both succeeded when they understood their specific situations and adapted their methods accordingly. By the 21st century, the Rhine crossings had entered cultural memory beyond purely military circles. The operations appeared in films, documentaries, novels, and video games. Popular culture's depiction wasn't always historically accurate. Films dramatized individual heroism while minimizing the grinding logistics that made heroism possible, but the operations remained in public consciousness. The Remagen bridge capture particularly captured popular imagination. The film The Bridge at Remagen, released in 1969, brought the story to millions who'd never read military histories. The cultural legacy ensured that even civilians with no military background knew that crossing the Rhine had been significant, had been difficult, had mattered to winning the war. The 80 years since 1945 hadn't eroded the Rhine crossing's place in collective memory of World War II. The operations remained iconic, symbolizing the final phase of Allied victory in Europe, representing military competence and soldier courage, demonstrating that seemingly impossible obstacles could be overcome through planning, resources, and willingness to pay the necessary price. March 7th, 2025, Remagen, Germany. 80 years to the day since Lieutenant Timmerman led his platoon across the Ludendorff Bridge. The bridge is long gone. It collapsed in March 1945 and was never rebuilt. But the stone towers that anchored the bridge on both shores remain, preserved as monuments. Sarah Mitchell, an American college student studying in Germany, stands in the Peace Museum housed in the Western Towers. She's the great-granddaughter of Bombardier James Mitchell, the British artilleryman who fired his 25-pounder during Operation Plunder's preparatory bombardment. Sarah has come to Remagen to understand what her great-grandfather experienced, to connect with history that shaped her family but feels increasingly distant. The museum displays are comprehensive. Photographs of the bridge capture, artifacts recovered from the Rhine, personal accounts from soldiers on both sides. Sarah reads a letter her great-grandfather wrote in April 1945, describing the crossing. His handwriting is shaky, the letter stained and worn. "We crossed the Rhine last night," he wrote. "I never want to do anything like that again. Too many good men didn't make it across. But we're in Germany now. Maybe the war will end soon. I hope I live to see it." He did live, survived the war, returned to England, raised a family. Sarah exists because he survived that night in March 1945. The Rhine flows peacefully outside the museum windows, tourist boats cruising past, the water reflecting afternoon sunlight. It's hard to imagine that 80 years ago, this river was a battlefield. The Rhine today is unrecognizable from its 1945 appearance. Modern bridges span the river at regular intervals, highway bridges carrying thousands of vehicles daily, railroad bridges connecting European cities, pedestrian bridges allowing casual strolls across water that once required military assault to traverse. The bridges are elegant structures of steel and concrete, designed by architects who prioritized aesthetics as much as function. They bear no resemblance to the utilitarian Bailey bridges and pontoon bridges thrown across the Rhine under fire 8 decades ago. River traffic is commercial and recreational cargo barges carrying containers, cruise ships hosting tourists, small pleasure boats. The Rhine has returned to its historic role as commercial artery connecting European economies. The scars of war have healed, physically if not entirely from memory. The crossing sites themselves show few visible traces of 1945's battles. Wesel was 97% destroyed during Operation Plunder. The city has been completely rebuilt, its medieval character reconstructed in some areas, modernist architecture dominating others. A visitor walking through Wesel today sees a prosperous German city with no obvious evidence that it was once an apocalyptic battlefield. Only a few markers and memorials indicate what happened here. A plaque on the riverbank notes the March 24th crossing. A small monument honours British and Canadian soldiers killed during plunder. But these memorials are discreet, easily overlooked. The city has moved on. Oppenheim shows even less evidence of Patton's crossing. The town is charming, its vineyards producing wine that sustains the local economy. Tourist information mentions the American crossing in March 1945 but doesn't emphasise it. The focus is on the town's medieval churches and its excellent Riesling, not its brief moment as a military objective. The Peace Museum at Remagen represents the most comprehensive effort to preserve Rhine crossing memory. The museum's mission is educational and commemorative. Exhibits explain the bridge's construction during World War I, its role in World War II, and its capture and collapse in March 1945. Personal artifacts, uniforms, weapons, photographs, letters humanise the history. Video interviews with veterans, recorded before most died, provide first-hand accounts. The museum doesn't glorify war, but doesn't shy from its realities either. Casualty figures are displayed prominently. Photographs of dead soldiers aren't censored. The museum trustees believe that understanding war's costs is essential to preventing future wars. Annual visitor numbers exceed 500,000, suggesting the mission resonates. School groups tour regularly. German students learning about their country's history. American students understanding what their grandfather's generation experienced. Archaeological discoveries continue revealing physical remnants of Rhine crossing operations. Construction projects along the riverbanks regularly uncover artifacts, spent artillery, shells, corroded weapons, fragments of assault boats, personal items lost during crossings. In 2015, construction workers excavating for a new bridge foundation at Oppenheim discovered a complete American assault boat buried in river sediment. The boat was remarkably preserved, its plywood hull intact after 70 years underwater. Archaeologists carefully excavated and preserved it. The boat is now displayed at the Remagen Museum, a tangible connection to the March crossing. More ominously, unexploded ordnance remains. German bomb disposal teams still deactivate approximately 2,000 Rhine crossing-era munitions annually, artillery shells that failed to explode, mortar rounds buried in sediment, grenades lost during combat. 80 years later, the Rhine crossing's physical legacy remains literally explosive. The memory politics surrounding Rhine crossings reflect evolving European attitudes toward World War II. In the immediate post-war decades, German commemoration emphasized suffering civilian casualties, destroyed cities, the tragedy of war. American and British commemoration emphasized victory and liberation, defeating Nazi tyranny, freeing Europe. These narratives weren't entirely compatible. German civilians remembered Allied artillery and bombing that killed their families. Allied veterans remembered fighting a necessary war against fascism. Over decades, the narratives have partially converged. Modern commemorations at Rhine crossing sites include German and Allied veterans together, honouring all who died while acknowledging the moral complexities. The evolution reflects broader European integration. The Rhine, once a boundary between enemies, now flows through the European Union's heart, connecting member nations in peaceful economic and political union. Descendants of Rhine crossing participants have formed organisations to preserve family histories and connect with others whose families experienced the crossings. The Rhine Crossing Legacy Project, established in 2010, collects oral histories, letters, photographs, and artefacts from families of soldiers who participated. The organisation has gathered over 1,500 personal accounts from American, British, Canadian, and German families. The accounts are digitised and made available to researchers and descendants. Catherine Weber, whose grandfather was a German artillery officer who fired on Allied crossings at Wesel, found her grandfather's diary through the project. The diary described his internal conflict, duty to defend Germany versus growing awareness that the Nazi cause was criminal. Reading his words helped me understand him, Weber said. He did terrible things during the war, but he was also a human being in an impossible situation. I can acknowledge both truths now. The environmental legacy of Rhine crossings is surprisingly minimal given the scale of combat. The Rhine's ecosystem recovered relatively quickly from wartime pollution and disruption. Fish populations that declined during the war years, partly from combat pollution, partly from general wartime environmental degradation, rebounded in the 1950s and 60s. Modern environmental monitoring shows Rhine water quality at historically high levels. The river's ecological resilience suggests that nature heals faster than human memory. Where soldiers once died crossing under fire, salmon now spawn in clean water. The contrast between past violence and present peace is stark. The Rhine's environmental recovery offers metaphorical hope. If the river could heal from war's devastation, perhaps human societies can too. The strategic lessons about rivers as military obstacles remain relevant in 21st century conflicts. Modern militaries still study Rhine crossings when planning operations that might involve contested river crossings. The fundamental challenges haven't changed despite technological advances. Rivers remain difficult to cross under fire. Defenders still hold advantages. Attackers still face vulnerabilities during crossing. Modern technology, precision weapons, real-time reconnaissance, advanced bridging equipment changes tactical details but not strategic fundamentals. When Russian forces attempted to cross the Seversky Donets River in Ukraine in 2022, military analysts worldwide compared the failed attempt to Rhine crossing lessons. The Russians had ignored principles learned 80 years earlier, and they paid a catastrophic price. Rhine crossing doctrine, properly understood and applied, remains operationally relevant. The tourism industry has developed around Rhine crossing sites, though it remains relatively modest compared to D-Day battlefield tourism in Normandy. Tour companies offer Rhine crossing tours that visit Remagen, Wesel, Oppenheim, and other sites. The tours attract military history enthusiasts, veterans' descendants, and students. Local economies benefit modestly. Hotels, restaurants, tour guides earn revenue from historical tourism. But Rhine crossing tourism hasn't reached the scale that transforms local communities. The sites remain authentic rather than commercialized. There are no theme parks, no excessive souvenir shops, no Disney-style historical experiences. The preservation is dignified and educational rather than entertainment-focused. This seems appropriate. The Rhine crossings were too serious, too costly in human terms, to be reduced to tourist attractions. The educational programs ensure younger generations understand Rhine crossing's significance. German schools include Rhine crossing history in World War II curriculum, teaching students about the war's final phases and Germany's defeat. American and British schools are less consistent. Some include Rhine crossings in European history courses, others don't. The variation reflects differing educational priorities and the challenge of covering vast historical content in limited time. Military academies worldwide still teach Rhine crossings as case studies in operational art. Officers from dozens of countries have studied Remagen, Oppenheim, and Plunder as part of their professional education. The operations have transcended their original context to become timeless examples of military planning, execution, adaptation, and leadership. The final crossing site memorial, completed in 2020 at Wesel, includes the names of all British, Canadian, and German soldiers killed during Operation Plunder. The memorial wall contains over 7,000 names, 5,000 Allied, 2,000 German. Finding and verifying the names required years of archival research in multiple countries. Many German defenders were never formally identified, their bodies buried in mass graves or lost in the Rhine. The memorial includes a section for unknown soldiers, defenders of the Rhine, acknowledging those who died without leaving names behind. The dedication ceremony in March 2020 brought together descendants from all sides. Hans Müller, grandson of the 16-year-old Volkssturm soldier mentioned earlier, spoke, "My grandfather was conscripted to fight a war he didn't believe in, defending a regime he didn't support. He survived, but he carried guilt for the rest of his life. This memorial honours all who suffered, regardless of which uniform they wore. That's important. We can't change the past, but we can remember it honestly." March 25. Sarah Mitchell leaves the Remagen Peace Museum and walks to the riverbank. She stands where American soldiers landed 80 years ago, where her great-grandfather's artillery supported the crossings 20 kilometres north, A tour boat passes, its passengers waving cheerfully. Across the river, cars cross a modern highway bridge, their drivers thinking about appointments and errands, not history. The Rhine flows on, indifferent to human conflicts, connecting Switzerland to the Netherlands as it has for millennia. Sarah thinks about the letter her great-grandfather wrote, about the men who didn't make it across, about the bridge that stood for 10 critical days before collapsing. She thinks about how the Rhine was a barrier that seemed insurmountable in early 1945, how crossing it required extraordinary courage and sacrifice, how its crossing changed history. And she thinks about how today, 80 years later, the Rhine is just a river again, beautiful, peaceful, unifying rather than dividing. Perhaps that's the real legacy, Sarah reflects. The crossings mattered enormously at the time. They ended a war, they defeated fascism, they cost thousands of lives. But ultimately, they enabled peace. The river that was once a battlefield became a border, then the border dissolved into the European Union's free movement. The violence made the peace possible. The sacrifices of 1945 created the Europe of 2025. Sarah photographs the river, the towers, the peaceful scene. She'll share the images with her family, tell them about visiting the place their great-grandfather fought. The story continues, passed from generation to generation, memory preserved, even as direct experience fades. The Rhine remains, the crossings are history, the lessons endure.